Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 169 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy.
God damn it.
Here with Dave Park. Today we are talking to John Foxx and Till Paasche. They are the authors of America's War in Syria, Fighting with Kurdish Anti-ISIS Forces. Both of these guys were foreign international volunteers in northeast Syria in the area known as Rojava. They volunteered with the YPG, or YPG, the People's Protection Units in Syria fighting ISIS. So there are three authors in this book. One is John, the other is Till, and then the third is Sean Murray, who isn't here today. But each of these guys, different countries, different national origins, different backgrounds, but you all found yourselves fighting the same war. Mm-hmm. And so this was a really great book with a lot of different experiences and perspectives in it. I really enjoyed it. And I just want to thank both of you guys for being here with us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So let's get into first the origin story. And this is a little bit different, guys. So pardon me if it's a little difficult to coordinate, because for the first time we have one guest here that's in person and one who's remote. But we'll do the best we can. So let's start with you, John. And I want to ask you a little bit about your origin story, sort of your upbringing, and what was that path that took you towards first the Marine Corps and then eventually the YPG?
Okay, so the Marine Corps, I'd say it was on my radar starting, I'd say, junior year of high school, which would have been 2007 for me. I reached a fork in the road, I guess. Everybody was taking the SAT to go to college, and I had to decide what I wanted to do. College wasn't my preference at the time, and I was really interested in what the military had to offer. So it was right about that time where I started looking at the individual branches, and of course the Marine Corps, the dress blues. I was sold.
And you're from here. You're from Brooklyn.
Yes, sir. Yeah. I went to high school in Staten Island, St. Joseph by the Sea. So I made the decision. In my head, I wanted to join the Marine Corps. And then I started senior year in high school. And then coincidentally, I think it was that December, the Marine Corps recruiters set up a table at my high school. And then that weekend, I was in the recruiter's office signing my papers. And then we were the last group to sign our contracts to the U.S. military out of Brooklyn MEPS in 2007. So,
and what was your MOS? What was your job in the Marine Corps?
I was an infantryman.
Awesome.
So I went to the School of Infantry in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I graduated as an 0352, which is a tow gunner. Never got to shoot a tow. Went to 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines in the 1st Marine Division. And I went to a weapons company to where we got to roll around in Humvees. And if we were lucky, we got to have a tow on top. If not, it was mostly the 50 cal, the 40 Mike, or the 240 that we rolled around with.
And did you get deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq? I mean, what year was this also?
I got to 2.5 in 2008.
Okay.
I didn't get to go to Afghanistan or to Iraq with the Marine Corps. So my battalion, we were in 2009. We did our second MEU in a row for the battalion. It was my first MEU. So we flew over to Okinawa, Japan, and then we hopped on a ship, and then we floated around Southeast Asia and trained with fellow NATO forces. And then we did the same thing again the next year.
Okay.
And so I got out of the Marine Corps without a combat deployment.
Were you disappointed by that when you were in the Marine Corps?
As an infantryman.
Yeah, especially in that time frame.
Extremely.
Yeah.
I get it. And so a few years go by, and this whole ISIS thing starts kicking up in the Middle East. So we're looking at 2000. Okay, so Syria goes down in 2012, 13, 14. You're seeing ISIS sweep across the Middle East. What's going through your head at that point?
To be quite honest, starting 2012, I think I was monitoring all of the conflicts around the world. And the Arab Spring, I'd say, was pretty fresh from what I remember.
Yeah.
I think my first semester in college in fall 2012, we were discussing Turkey and Syria at the time. And so I was monitoring all the conflicts and honestly looking for a way to find a way for myself to be involved. And then I was monitoring Syria and the YPG. I saw the Peshmerga as well at the time. And I was monitoring that very closely. And then, sure enough, the name Jordan Mattson and the headline accompanying his name popped up. American makes his way to Syrian front lines. So I reached out to him on social media and asked him how we did it, how we can join and help, how can we contribute to the cause. And then I believe the YPG at the time, they were sorting out their own Facebook page to where they could accommodate foreigners.
I met Jordan over there.
Yes?
Yeah, I hope he's doing well wherever he is today.
I haven't heard from him in a while. I believe last I heard from him, he was in Sweden doing very well. I think he has a son.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And so you connected with Jordan. He kind of lets you, in on like, hey, here's how it works. This is how you get over to Syria and join up with the YPG. And you just took the plunge.
Yes. He connected me with their Facebook page. I contacted them. And it was oddly vague. It was, you show up to Suleimania Airport in Iraq, and one of us will pick you up from the outside once you get through customs. That didn't happen with me. I got through customs. I was questioned, of course. It was, I suppose, maybe out of the ordinary for them at first during that time. And eventually I was able to hop into a cab, take it to a hotel where I would log on to the Wi-Fi and then contact the YPG and say, hey, nobody picked me up. I'm at this hotel in Suleimania. And then sure enough, somebody came to meet me there.
So let's kick it over to Till for a moment. Till, you have a totally different background than John.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your origins and upbringing and the path that eventually carried you over to Syria.
Yeah, I'm basically the very opposite of John. I'm like born in 1980, Western Germany, to very anti-war and pacifist parents. Given my grandparents' complicity in the Second World War, there was my parents' generation were very much anti-war. When I was like 2 years old, I would apparently demonstrate against the stationing of Pershing mid-range rockets in Western Germany. All of that from school, traveling the world, and then joining uni. So very sheltered, protected life. Also very boring life, right? Growing up in the 1990s in Western suburbia, it was like just incredibly boring. So yeah, I always felt that there's more out there. I've been traveling a lot, Africa, Southeast Asia, all of that. And didn't really know what to do, started studying, stayed at university, did my PhD in political geography in the UK then. And then been jumping around as an academic, postgrad, postdoc, different universities in different European countries. And it was, again, incredibly boring. So via some connection, I had the offer to go to Kurdistan, to university. I didn't have to write any grants to get research money, do any of this bullshit. So I jumped at the opportunity. I always had I was a young punk in Germany. So I had this, I liked the political underdog, which the Kurds were always in the last 100+ years, right? So I was like, the Kurds were, and there's a huge Kurdish diaspora in Germany. So the Kurds were always on my radar. I find it kind of interesting. And at the time, I was like a political geographer. And in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish regions there, the KRG, Kurdish Regional, what's under the administration of the Kurdistan Regional Government, they offered me a position at a university. I could do whatever I wanted. I did a bit of teaching. And then did my research on security in the region. You know, I would go to, and that was all pre-ISIS still. I would go to Kirkuk, look at the tensions with the Iraqi government. I would take the taxi up to Kandil Mountains to see PKK, do some interviews with them, just to, you know, to understand the region, write papers, publish. And then ISIS came and kind of changed everything, right? The Kurdistan region in Iraq prior ISIS was like going up. There was like boom. There was new oil fields discovered. A lot of Westerners, a lot of American oil companies there. It was kind of some of the last massive onshore oil fields easily accessible in those Kurdish mountains. Saddam could never get there because of the Kurdish resistance, but now it was like fair game. So it was like a bit of a Wild West, the new Gulf. And then ISIS came and changed everything from one day to another, really, getting into Mosul. And that really changed everything. And I kind of got sucked into the conflict bit by bit by bit. And I went to Rojava, Syria, to see what's going on there. Who are the YPG? What are they doing? What is the civil administration like? And I remember on one of these research trips, I would sit, and it's in the book, right? I'd sit in this camp of this Yazidi family. And just a couple of days before, they made it out of Shingal that was surrounded by Daesh. And it was really, like it or not, it was PKK holding line. And all the small teams, guerrilla teams, lost their life, right? Kind of covering the retreat of the Yazidis on this one high mountain and the otherwise flat desert. And then it was YPG who punched their way through the ISIS lines from Syria. Really, like they risked an international incident by crossing the Syrian-Iraqi border, punched a line into ISIS defenses, and had like all these refugees kind of able to get out of Shingal in Iraq into Syria and to a refugee camp there. So there was me like sitting in this family, and it was like they just escaped genocide. It was this, I can't really describe the atmosphere. It was very depressing is the right word. It was in shock. People were in shock, literally. And I was sitting in this tent, like people, you walk through the camp, people invite you in. So the family invites me in. And the wife was heavily pregnant. She still had a round in her ankle somewhere. The husband was completely shaken up. I believe one of their young sons died on the mountain of dehydration. His body was still there. It was dark. And like in that very moment, I knew, like, given my German history and my, talking about or not liking the idea of fascism, and, that is such an important part of German history. And I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just go back and write another paper about it and be the experts when there's like literally kids fighting for their survival. So I joined YPG. I took the taxi to the mountain camp, said to the Havals, look, this is me. I'm already, I know the region fairly well. I want to join you guys. And since I have a PhD and the Kurds really like academics, it was fairly easy for me to get in. And then 7 days of training, right? 7 rounds or 5 rounds with the AK on the range, and off to the front line you go. And that's that. Yeah.
There's one more author of the book who's not with us today, Sean Murray. I don't know which of you would like, but would one of you like to give a brief overview of Sean and his background, because he's a prominent and interesting character in this book as well.
Yeah, if that's okay, John, I go ahead.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah, Sean, what a character. Irish guy, grew up in London, and He never he was the Irish guy in London during the tail end of the IRA troubles and like the siege on London, bombings there. So as we say in this book, he was always looking for kind of identity and what does he want to be? He isn't really Irish because Irish were the terrorists. He isn't really to the English. He was always the Irish. To the Irish, he was the English guy. And then he joined the Royal Irish Regiment, right? A kind of a prestigious military unit, infantry unit born out of historic displacement, really. Very interesting biography. And he saw ISIS during his time in the military. And with his buddies, he watched all these videos about Daesh taking over checkpoints in Iraq, just willy-nilly driving through Anbar, through Mosul, just like they owned the place, which they did at the time. And the British army wasn't getting ready to intervene. Like he joined the British military, so shit like this isn't happening.
And he was like a very idealistic person, like about
absolutely
ideas about democracy and freedom, and like we should be out there at the forefront, fighting a group like this.
Yeah, he believed in like Fukuyama's argument of the end of history after the end of the Cold War, right? The West won, capitalism won. Everyone should celebrate that, it's now like peace forever. But that wasn't the case. And he felt that the West didn't respond, or his own military, the British military he was part of, wasn't really intervening. And there's this interesting bit. People would ask him, why didn't you join the Irish military? And he would say, why would I? The Irish don't do peacekeeping missions. Well, they did in Africa, actually. There's a really good Netflix video about it, but not to the extent that the British did it. So he was like, yeah, fuck this. I joined the Brits. I want to go around and bring democracy to people. That was his idealist idea. Yeah, and then that didn't happen, and basically straight from the barracks, he hopped on a flight to, again, northern Iraq, Kurdistan, and joined YPG. And we met in the mountains, being smuggled in together into Syria.
So I think we kind of established your guys, the three of you, your path into Syria and joining up with the YPG. To back up for a second, for some of the viewers who maybe don't know, let's talk a little bit about what the YPG was and the YPJ was, the People's Protection Units. You guys feel free to pick up wherever you want here. Where do you want to start with this?
Actually, I think it would be very interesting, and we've talked about this really briefly on the show, and Jack, I know you're an expert in this, but I'm not. But can we talk about Kurdistan in general and the YPG, the PUK, the KDP, the Peshmerga, like who they were before ISIS, and then how it all happened?
Yeah, it's like, if that's okay, John, I'll take this one.
Yep.
Well, the Kurds were fighting for a state since the end of the First World War. And the Kurds are basically, it roughly translates into mountain people. And they would live in the Zagros mountain range that goes through Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and there would basically be the geopolitical losers of all the political processes going on. So when after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was basically being broken up and had to retreat, the French and the British started structuring, especially the French and the British, started dividing up the region, and the Arabs got the state, etc., etc. The Kurds didn't. So since 100 years plus, they're fighting essentially for state, but if you would talk to many Kurds, they wouldn't use the word state. They talk about identity, for the right to sing our songs, to eat our food, to dance our dances, live our culture, because this is all illegal in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Like Kurds were, forcefully assimilated into those nation states. And they always resisted because they were the losers, like, take the Syrian Kurds. The Assad regime made them basically stateless. 200,000-300,000 Kurds suddenly lost their Syrian citizenship, lost their right to go to school, see a doctor, anything. So there was this old 100-year-old Kurdish struggle for autonomy. And the Kurds that most known to the Americans would be the Iraqi ones, right? KDP, PUK, the guys Sam Faddis worked with, for example. And so I think going back a little, we make a mistake by talk about the Kurds. They're by no means a homogeneous groups. They're
Right.
like split up into various different parties.
And
This is
you
Kurdish.
can see the Iranian Kurds are getting a little froggy right now as they see.
Absolutely, absolutely, for good reasons. And
Yeah.
like it's yeah, and so they were always fighting for identity and fighting the Iraqi state, Saddam, the Assad, the Turkish state, the Iranian regime. But if they weren't fighting those regimes, they would fight each other. So it's not a homogeneous group. But especially the Iraqi Kurds, they kind of, after 91, there was the uprising. Then there was a crackdown by Saddam. There was a no-fly zones. And then slowly Kurdish autonomy started establishing in northern Iraq. And that was like, it's referred to in the 90s in the golden age of Kurdistan. The Kurds got a de facto country without having a country. It's a difference between independence and autonomy, right? So they had this autonomous region where they could govern their own affairs. And this was a major milestone. And then the 2003 Iraq invasion happened, and the Kurds were very close allies to the Americans, very loyal allies to the Americans. I don't think any American or British serviceman or women died in combat in the Kurdish region by the hands of Kurds, very loyal fighters. And they pushed Saddam out pretty fast with the Americans and extended their autonomy. And that kind of kept going on until really ISIS suddenly appeared and reshifted the entire region and destabilized the entire region, including Kurdistan. And the Yazidis are technically parts of the Kurds. So yeah, there was a major destabilization. In the autonomous Kurdish region, you have 4 million Kurds, and you had 2 million in IDPs coming in, seeking shelter. You had whole Iraqi units withdrawing into Kurdistan to seek shelter from ISIS. And from Kurdistan, a lot of the counteroffensives would be launched. So Iraqi units would deploy to Kurdistan and push from there with the help of the Peshmerga. But altogether, like it's a very chaotic situation. And explaining Kurdistan in 5 minutes is very challenging because there's so much going on.
Pick up with Rojava specifically. About how that sort of like we were talking a little bit before the show sprouted into existence during the conflict with ISIS.
Yeah.
It was not just a counteroffensive, so to speak. It was like the birth of a new nation taking place in the midst of this war.
Yes, absolutely. So, like I'd say, from all the parties that fought ISIS, everyone for continuing a status quo, including the Peshmerga. They didn't fight for anything, for any new political theory. That the Syrian Kurds did, though, right? They didn't fight for a status quo, but they fought for something better than what they had before ISIS. They had very innovative, revolutionary political theory that comes from the PKK guerrillas in the mountains, right? The famous terrorists that fight the Turkish state. And these theories about freedom, about federalism, about breaking up the monopoly in violence and have different ethnic and religious militias securing basically different ethnic and religious villages. It wasn't that the Assad regime or the Iraqi government was supposed to provide security. The Kurdish idea was that the people provide their own security because, frankly speaking, the nation states and the region sucked at it. So the Kurds had an idea where they basically fought to give power to other minorities. The Christians, the Yazidis, the Arabs in the alliance, and not a lot of parties in this conflict fight to give up power, right, when they win. That's a new idea. And that resonated with many people in the region, Westerners as well as locals. So Rojava as this idea gained really quick momentum. And a lot of people flocked there because, a lot of leftists flocked there. A lot of guys like John flocked there because they wanted to be part of something. And this is what many of the volunteers said, bigger than themselves. And that's, we wanted to be part of something that's bigger than us. And they found that in Rojava. and this kind of autonomy project, where they, the Assad regime, once the turmoil kicked off, pulled out of the Kurdish areas. Assad understood Kurdish theory enough to understand that by pulling out and giving up Kurdistan, he's not going to jeopardize Syrian territorial integrity. So he understood the Kurdish political theory and actually pulled out to secure Damascus and the rump state, what academics have called it, like to stay in power, basically. Damascus and his allied strongholds, that's where all the Syrian forces retreated before they got Iranian help, before they got Hezbollah to come in, before they got the Russians to come in and help. So they just pulled out overnight of the Kurdish regions, and the Kurds had to secure their borders. And because the Kurds also fight for the right, to be religious, for the right to be Muslim, for the right to be Christian, and for the right not to believe in any God, the Islamists hated them from the beginning and assaulted the region mercilessly, immediately. So yeah, you had basically a ragtag militia kind of pop up to secure the people, and that was a People's Protection Unit. And when it was clear that they couldn't hold the line because they lacked support, they lacked guns, they lacked ammunition, PKK came in from the mountain, and just like they did with the Yazidis, they secured these people. And this is where it gets a bit tricky, right?
Right. There's, I remember someone explicitly making the comment to me that the YPG was created more or less because the PKK was on America's FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. Mm-hmm. We could work with the YPG. We couldn't work with the PKK. Whether anyone agrees or disagrees with that status on the FTO is debatable, of course. Go ahead.
Well, it's about Turkey. It's about NATO,
yeah,
right? Turkey is a NATO country. PKK is fighting for Kurdish rights in NATO. They're fighting a fellow NATO ally. So, yeah, they're terrorists.
It'd be like labeling, in a way, like the Irish dissidents is the entire Irish population is terrorists because they're, during the Troubles.
Absolutely.
So, well, first off, before we launch into the next thing, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor for this show real quick. Got to let people know out there about the sponsor for this show. Mad Rabbit. So if any of you guys out there have tattoos that you got a long time ago and they're kind of getting older and they're starting to fade, Mad Rabbit makes a series of different sorts of like balms that you can put on that increase the longevity of your tattoos. And we really hope you guys will go and check them out. The website, D?
Is madrabbit.com/team. It's
madrabbit.com/team,
and you get 25% off your order.
To get 25% off. So madrabbit.com/team to get 20% off your order.
Yeah, and not just like, Jack and I both have tattoos. You guys have probably seen on some of the shows where we get half naked and show them off. But whenever you get a tattoo, like taking care of that tattoo is important. If you don't want it to fade, if you don't want to look like, like Popeye at 80 probably didn't, his tats probably didn't look great. And that's because he didn't have Mad Rabbit. If you have tattoos, like you need something to take care of them, to keep that ink sharp, to keep the
John,
lines
you got to show us that ink? I can see.
Yeah.
I can see from here.
And what did they used to do, right? They used to just cover them up and then you'd rub like baby oil or whatever on them, right?
I think we're on Alpha 4, something like that.
I have no idea. Like back in my day, it was like alcohol and baby oil. It's like, it stings.
Oh, wow.
It feels good.
Is that a 9/11 tattoo, John?
Well, it's a New York tattoo. It's got the skyline. We've got the Staten Island Ferry,
Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, and then of course the American flag, and then on the back here we've got the Twin Towers. But
okay, cool, man.
Yeah.
We'll circle back around on this topic with the Syrian Defense Forces, the SDF. John, could you tell us a little bit about like showing up in the YPG? And I'd like to hear a little bit about like the culture of the Tabors or Tabors. Sorry, what's the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, the Tabors.
The Tabors. Mm-hmm. And like what their composition was like, how that kind of differed from the Marines, and what it was like to integrate into one of these units.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Marine Corps, the meritocracy was a lot different than the YPG structure. The YPG, it was a lot about how well you speak, or as a foreigner, how well you can learn the language, and how well you abide by their customs, which consists of no showing of the elbows, essentially respecting the women, not showing too much of your ankles, not showing your elbows, your arms, being very respectful when offered things like such as chai or anything along those lines. Being very respectful and learning their culture. Whereas the Marine Corps, it's all about knowledge. How well you know the knowledge and how well you can PT. That places you on the ladder. Yeah.
What was like the composition? Because like as opposed to like a Marine platoon, Tabor breaks down in like how do they break down into different teams and they each have like what 3 Hiluxes? Like a Tabor is like very very roughly equivalent to a platoon, like a platoon strength element.
Mm-hmm. So the Tabors, the Hiluxes, it was based off of availability. If you were lucky, you would get essentially one squad per Hilux, which I'd say would be anywhere from 7 to 12 persons. So you would have your Tabor, and then you have your TACOMs, which are essentially your squads. So you'd have about 3 to 4 TACOMs per Tabor, and those were the individuals you would train with when you were lucky enough to get training. And they were the ones you would develop camaraderie with. And then of course, a little bit south of the TACOM, you get your fire team. And which is you'd have your Big C gunner, which is the machine gunner. They'd have the
PKM.
PKM. Mm-hmm. And then you'd have your RPG gunner, which is the Bisving gunner. And then, of course, your team leader, and then everybody else. So it was very similar to the Marine Corps, but also very different at the same time.
Is being that the importance was on your respect and your knowledge of the culture and things like that. Were there Westerners like involved, like higher up, who had no tactical ability whatsoever, but because they were culturally savvy, were put in positions that they potentially maybe they shouldn't have been in?
I would say so. The Kurds were very big on respect and how well you got to know their culture. The better you got to know their culture and the quicker you got to know their culture, the better off you were. So there were certainly few individuals that were looked highly upon and received positions that maybe they didn't necessarily learn through their combat experiences or contributions to the YPG.
And it also became like overall an issue with inexperienced people coming to the forefront. I think one of you had that experience where the platoon leader, not his fault, but I think you wrote in the book, the prerequisite to become a platoon leader was being 23 years old and still alive. Just because so many, I mean, people don't really understand, like, this was a terrible conflict and a lot of Kurds died and a lot of allies, Arab allies, died fighting in Syria, fighting for us essentially for the Syrian Defense Force Alliance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that certainly was. It was very obvious during the battle for Manbij. My platoon commander, personally, he was not at the front line. It was us. It was, I guess, the rest of the Tabor. He was back behind friendly lines. And he was not observing what we were observing. So he was giving orders that maybe didn't correlate with what exactly we were seeing on the front lines as his Tabor. And so it was, that certainly became a problem at some point.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear about...
sorry, I got very close to punching that commander. Oh. Sorry,
you got very close to punching
I got very close to punching John's commander. He was my commander first and in a unit, and I knew his bad news. Like, I found a little falcon. Bas, my fighting name means falcon. I found a little falcon, and that asshole stole the falcon from me prior to the Manbij job.
Like
so
falcon?
A real falcon, a little falcon fell out of his nest. No, mama. He
Yeah.
looked for someone. I found him. The asshole stole him, so I knew he's bad news. And then later, like half of his unit came through our ambulance. Like I was furious about that guy. I was like, "How dare you!" Like, I got very. I punched another commander, but not this one. But I got very close.
So,
and
which of you were actually like in it first?
John.
John, and how did you guys meet?
We met the first time we met in this horrible place called the Academy. It's kind of this hub for all Westerners going in and out the conflict. If they're changing units, they kind of hang out there, and it's like hell. It's the worst, most depressing place.
Is that the place where the railroad tracks are?
I think so. Yeah. No. That's a slightly different place.
Okay.
The Academy. It kept changing place. And it was like they tried to keep it a secret, but it was just the most miserable place, and the most frustrating place, because like this is also where all the YPG didn't vet. Any idiot could show up in the conflict, and then they realized in Syria, oh, hang on, I'm not cut out for this. I want to go home.
Right.
And then they all were stranded there, and it was a nightmare. But this is where we met, and like with time, you had the guys that already fought and just were there for R&R or something to catch a breather, and then they had the newbies that still had to prove themselves. So
And were you in
Yeah,
Nubia at that
John went. Yeah, me and John went the room with the vets, so we started talking.
Okay.
And shooting the shit, but and then we met on and off behind the front line. But really, like our bonding moment was during Manbij, when like I was on this bongo. This is a scene where we start the book with, where I'm like on this bongo van, with civilian driver, like 10 civilians fucked up by mines. They escaped the besieged city through a ring of landmines and IEDs. So I hijacked the civilian van, put all the civvies on the back, and tried to get out. And I was like, fuck, I can't do this alone. Like I'm driving around the front line, with an Arab driver who doesn't understand me. Like it was a complete shit show. So I remembered this Marine being like with his unit nearby. So I told the driver, like, pull up there. And there was John. I was like, dude, I need your help. He grabbed his rig, hopped on the back, stabilized some of the casualties, and then the driver fucked off to the next hospital. And like the two of us basically hanging on the side of this bongo van, trying to get everyone out alive. And like, this is a, like I say it in the book, it's a moment maybe, only some maybe other combat veterans can relate to, because like a moment like this, as a bonding, like it's a very deep bond, right? It was the worst moment in my entire life.
Right.
Easily. It was a horrible day. It was like 40 civilians and like 3 medics.
How long had you been serving with the YPG at this point in time?
About half a year. So I was there for about half a year, and then went back to Germany, did a 3-week medic course, and went back as a combat medic.
And then what about you, John? How long had you been serving in the YPG at this point in time?
At this point, I'd say, let me see. It was about roughly 2 months the first time. And then May, June, the second time was about 5-6 months. So I'd say about, at most, 8 months total.
Okay.
About 7-8 months.
And so this was, I remember, as you describe it, Till, I remember in the book, it's just like paragraph after paragraph of injured and dead civilians, and just terrible shit. But this was the big Manbij river crossing operation?
Yeah, that was just after the river crossing. Yeah.
Let's get into that a little bit, because that was a huge operation, obviously for SDF, but also for the Americans. I mean, there was SEALs, MARSOC, Special Forces, Delta. I mean, all of our guys had some little advisory role, whether it didn't really make the papers at the time, but it was
it was more than just advising.
Yeah. Well, you guys want to pick it up and tell us about that river crossing and then the subsequent battle?
Well, let the Marines start with the amphibious landing.
All right, go for it, John.
So we were building up for the Manbij operation for a few days. I think the first day it kind of came out of nowhere. we packed up from our noktas or our bases out in Tel Tamer, and we were told, all right, we're moving on to the next operation. We weren't told exactly what was going on. We might have been going to Manbij. We might have been going to Raqqa. We weren't told. So we went to a staging point that was west of Serikani, I'd say closer to Kobani. And we were at these silos, and everyone convened at these silos. And then we were told there's going to be a boat operation. And again, we have no idea, or at least on the Tabor level, and on the individual level, we have no idea where we are, where we're going. We're just told there's a boat operation coming up. And I told my Tabor leader, okay, I'd like to be on the first boat. I want to be on the first boat. Let's go. And then I was informed on exactly what's going on. My team was in fact the first boat, and there would be follow-up boats. And we were allegedly supposed to go at one night, and it was canceled due to the moon cover. I believe it wasn't
Too much illumination.
Yeah, I believe it was too much or something like that. To where we were delayed, and then the second night, we were good to go. We got the green light, so we loaded up in our Hiluxes, and then we rolled out to a staging point, and then from there, myself and my battle buddy, we kind of hung around for a little bit. We were waiting; nothing was going on, and then we posted up for a minute. We, had a seat. I think I racked out for a little bit just to get some rest. And then when I woke up to the sound of English being spoken. And I was like, okay, those aren't voices that I recognize. What's going on? And then I started looking around, and it looked like I saw the green lights on the eyes.
Vision.
So I saw night vision goggles.
Did you guys have night vision?
We did.
No.
Me personally, no.
No.
The Tabors, if you did, if you were lucky, you would have one thermal optic for the Tabor, and that would be rotated according to who was on watch.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So where I was at that point, I woke up, I heard English, and I said, okay, something's going on. And then to me, it looked like, according to the camis, it didn't look like Marpat, so I assumed they were Army. And then they were having some difficulty organizing the Kurds, trying to explain to them what they needed. Because and from what I understand from the situation was that their interpreter, he spoke Arabic, he didn't speak Kurmanji too well. So I heard this one individual, he was getting frustrated, and I said, "What do you need?" And then he explained it to me. He's like, I need 4 columns. And then I translated that in Kurdish. I explained to them 4 columns. And then they racked up. And then we moved out. So we started moving 1 column at a time. And then we came up. And then I could hear water as we're moving down this little path. I couldn't see very much. But I did hear the water. And then we came up on a house. And there were Zodiacs staged at this house. And then I hearing a few other of them talk. Apparently this house, they've been posted there for a few days. They've been watching the opposite bank, and they said they haven't seen any movement for days. So all the Kurds, we all loaded up into these Zodiacs, and then we made our way across the Euphrates River. And then one by one, the boats started making landing, and I could hear the C-130 above. It sounded like they might have been hammering targets or marking targets. I could certainly see what would look like flare grenades being fired and landing on the opposite bank, because it certainly lit up the bank for the boats. So to me, it looked like they were marking the LZ. So we started making our way across the river one by one. And then my boat, we pulled up on the opposite bank. We disembarked, and then and then our boat pilot, I helped him get back out. I had to kick him back out into the Euphrates, and then
The boat pilot was a MARSOC guy, right?
that's what he said. When I was on the boat, I had a pretty big backpack on my back, and he said to me, he said, I believe, he said, "Are you the medic?" And I said, "No." And I thought he understood the dynamics of being a foreigner with the Kurds, and he was asking me if I was corpsman or something. And I said no, but I was a Marine. And then there was a couple seconds of silence, and then he said, "I am a Marine." And I looked at him, and he had no weapon, he had no camis, he was I think he might have had 511s on and some shirt, and I thought, okay, this is what we're doing these days, okay. And then we get to the opposite bank, and he's going, "Go, go, go." And then I hopped off the side of the boat. And then he started screaming, "Hey, kick me back, kick me back." And nobody was responding, and I saw him. So I kicked him back out into the Euphrates. Ate shit after that.
Was this the first time that you had encountered U.S. forces that were like U.S. forces?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, that we worked face to face with. Yes, we had there allegedly were obviously U.S. forces in the battle for Al-Shadadi, which was a couple of months prior, but I never worked face to face with them.
Mm-hmm. You guys also, I mean, they were there quite a bit ways before us. The French special ops guys were in country.
Very much so. Yes. The French, I think I saw first. They were there since 2015 in the summer. We saw them first.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yep. So the French were there quite early because the French have a different connection to Syria. It used to be French mandate, right? So it's kind of their geopolitical history.
Their wheelhouse. Yeah.
Yep. And then the French also. They didn't want to wait for the US. They had their own attacks in France on French soil. And they were like, "Fuck it, we're going in."
Yeah.
The French also, the French state has a more of a positive affiliate, or they have a more positive dealings with PKK. There's a lot of PKK in France, not persecuted. So there's a bit of a history there. This is why there was this connection. But I'd say the first Western special forces, and, all the Westerners that talk, the Kurds talk. The first guys we kind of saw, everyone saw, it was like during the first offensives against the Caliphate in like May, June 2015, that fighting season. The French were there. They had this little internet van where they coordinated airstrikes with, but they were very much in the back. And then the next time, it was like 2015 fighting season, we would push first ISIS deep into the desert, past the Abdel Aziz mountain. Then we moved towards the Balik River, connect the Kobani and the Jazira Kurdish areas into one connected Kurdish area, pushed ISIS out of there. So the French were around. And then obviously end of fighting season comes November, the rain comes, mud comes. And in 2016, fighting season kicked off early, and like end of February, we went to take Al-Shadadi, and the French were there. At that point, I was one of the few combat medics, in inverted commas, really. I had a 3-week civilian training with a German Red Cross, but still was the highest qualified medic at the front line.
Wow.
I was the only one who had I had a backpack full with tourniquets, chest seals. So I was King Dingaling on the battlefield when it comes to injuries. And I was the only one who realized that you need designated vehicles to get injured out. It's about time. But that's, So we were like, because I was a medic, I was in the first unit going into like enemy's wasteland from Abdel Aziz Mountains. We would infiltrate. We would be like, I was in the first Hilux, and ahead of us would be sabotage. Our EOD guys looking for mines and shit. So we would get in, and immediately we get hit by VBIT. after the V-bit hit us, as soon as we got to the southern slopes of the mountain, we were attacked, and then French Fusiliers came up with javelins, I believe. And at the time, I was with a German, Shahid Rustem, who later died in that battle, and he was he was former French Foreign Legion. So he talked to them, and they were like cool with him. They were like chatting away.
Yeah.
And these were some of the first Western soldiers on the ground at the front line, armed, ready to blow shit up.
So, so for those of you who might not know, a VBIT is a vehicle-borne IED, which is a bomb in a car that's generally either parked on the side of the road or driven into a convoy if they can find a motivated individual.
Yeah.
So,
So
did that hit your vehicle or?
No, it was like you usually there's an idea around because like warning shots go like morph into the every rifle in the vicinity opens up. So you could usually hear them in, but in this case, like we got hit by V-bits a few times. Sometimes they come as civilian cars, pretending they ask, what's the best way to go, and boom. This one was an armored one, so they had steel plates to the front. Everything plings off. The Dushka truck, 12.5 millimeter, mounted on a truck. He couldn't move. He missed it. RPG missed it. So it drove right into, and then the gunner, the V-bit guy, he had this little the slit in the metal plating. He saw our YPG element move behind the building, drove into the building, detonated. Turns out a family sought shelter in the building. The whole thing collapsed on the family. Humongous shit show. It was and then the French came out after that.
Yeah,
because it was just flat desert, and we had nothing against V-bits.
Right.
Like if an armored one would come, you run. We don't have anything. Like you could, you shoot your AK against the steel plate.
That's when you need a tow gunner.
This is when you
need
a tow gunner.
With a tow,
ideally,
right.
Yeah. So this is when the French came in handy, and like it was a huge morale boost to see French special forces with their equipment right at the front lines.
Yeah.
So this was big, and then later advancing on the city, you would see the first Americans. Kind of being more an advisory role. You would see sometimes with Kurdish command and control element, you would see like Westerners up on the roof with his humongous pinos. And again, at the beginning, the French were more present. And then later, like Shaddad, so early 2016, February, March, the first Americans came out. But for political reasons, the Americans and the Brits were very careful because it was YPG, right? It was a Red Star, it was a PKK affiliation. And the White House and State Department, until that point, like wiggled around saying things like, oh, YPG isn't PKK, blah, 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 which is nonsense. And everyone knew that. But at that point, we had SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. It wasn't those guys, YPG anymore. It was Syrian Democratic Forces. Part of Syrian Democratic Forces were YPG and YPG, the all-women units, but it was also Arab units, Christian units, yada, yada, yada. So for the first time, the US administration could say, we're not fighting with PKK, we're not fighting with YPG, we're fighting with SDF.
Right.
It's tons of Arabs, it's tons of these moderate Islamists in there, it's Christians.
Right.
These are the good guys. So politically, America could side.
Right.
Obviously, America was bombing the shit out of ISIS before that. But on the ground, fighting them, it needed SDF. And by the way, SDF isn't an American invention. It is part of Kurdish political theory. And America just piggybacked on
the
SDF.
Syrian Democratic Forces.
Syrian Democratic Forces were part of Kurdish political theory. So the Kurdish Democratic Forces weren't a brainchild. Syrian Democratic Forces weren't a brainchild by the US. They were legit regional militia the US could use as a proxy force.
And the problem with the YPG in terms of the American, the American vision was that is it like a communist or Marxist aligned or at least idealized?
It used to be.
Okay.
It used to be. So if you open Wikipedia, it still says the thing about Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, blah, blah, blah. they change. They change their entire political theory, and we're trying to explain that a bit in the book, by 180 degrees. So yeah, they used to be Marxist-Leninists fighting for a communist state.
Right.
These days, the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces you meet in Syria right now, fighting for a federal system that resembles the founding fathers, the American founding fathers' ideas of freedom.
Right.
So there's nothing Marxist, Leninist, blah, blah, blah about them. The symbology is still there.
Right.
But, I always say, like, when I would explain YPG and the Kurds to American volunteers, they were all like, yeah, we're here even though they're communists. And I was like, hang on, they actually like strip all the flags and the symbology of, the red stars and the leftist vocabulary. It's very much a American style democracy, at least what it used to be.
When did that change happen?
When Öcalan was taken prisoner by the Turkish government.
It was in the 1990s.
It was in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, and it's very. I'm going into, at the risk of going into full lecture mode, but it was very, because Öcalan was not like, Öcalan was the movement's weak spot, right? His arrest was always a threat over the entire Kurdish movement. Once he was arrested, well, his arrest wasn't a threat anymore. They could actually intellectually advance the theory, and
Right.
they did. Öcalan did it from the prison cell, and what he came up with is about federalism, essentially, and active participation in politics.
I'd really encourage people, like, this could be like a whole episode in and of itself about democratic confederalism. And I really encourage people to go out there and read a little bit, read up on their own about how it borrows these ideas from Murray Bookchin, who his daughter still lives here in New York City.
Really?
She's really cool. And ideas from Swiss federalism, these ideas of
Yes.
cantons.
Yeah.
But then there's all these very avant-garde ideas in there about like social ecology and all these interesting things that are sort of thrown in there. And as you said earlier, it really is it's an experiment. It's like the Kurds, in this group of Kurds particularly, are really the one political entity that we're really trying, from my point of view at least, trying to do something new, that they had this like imagination or creativity to, it really is an experiment.
It is an experiment, and it's an experiment, and this is what many people like. You turn on the news these days and look at Iran, and everyone is chanting "Jin, Jiyan, Azadi." This is a Kurdish slogan. This is a base. What the women in Iran right now are shouting at the mullahs that suppress them is a Kurdish slogan. It is about the Kurdish revolution, and it basically assumes that you can only achieve a free society when the women are free. When the women are not oppressed any longer, we have freedom.
Right.
As long as and the Kurds in Syria, they take it to this very extreme level. The women there say, we don't need men. We don't want men for our physical safety anymore. It didn't work out so far, and it's not going to work out in the future. We have our own militia. If someone rapes us, we come after them. We have our own police force for women, by women. It's a very radical idea thrown into the Middle East, especially if you put that in contrast to Daesh, to ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them. And you see how this idea resonates in the region now. It resonates with the women in Iran, and it comes from the Kurdish mountain. It comes from a Turkish prison cell where Öcalan is basically being held, and it spreads all over the region. And like, if you want to theorize it a bit further, America's mistake in the war on terror was enforcing a political idea that was alien to the region. In Rojava, America supported a regional idea, or an organic idea of democracy, and that worked. This is why
I just want to throw it over to John for a second. As a Marine Corps veteran arriving in Rojava, not a whole lot of probably local knowledge, but from you said you learned the language pretty well. What was it like ideologically for you, going from U.S. Marine to YPG or YPG volunteer. What was that ideological component like for you to assimilate into it?
In the beginning, it was a polar opposites meeting, but over time, I got to understand where they were coming from, and I got to really sympathize where they were coming from. Coming from the Marine Corps, where if you just hammer a nail harder and harder, it eventually gets to where you need it to go. And then understanding the YPG and YPG to where that doesn't really work. Different nails require different amounts of strength and all of that. So understanding where they were coming from, it was an enlightening experience. Yeah, certainly, to say the least. Especially for how they objectively see the world compared to how myself, just your Marine grunt, just hammering nails.
Can you explain that at all? I know that's probably a huge, like a very abstract concept, but can you explain sort of how they see the world versus how, like, an American soldier or Marine might see the world?
Mm-hmm. I'd say as a Marine, we're hyper realism. That's kind of, or I would assume any American veteran is hyper realistic when it comes to anything, policies, procedures. And the Kurds, they were pretty loose, mm-hmm. and much more extremely more sympathetic when it came to certain things.
Like decisions are arrived by conversation and like talking, right?
I'd say so. But for example, as an example, specifically in like the Battle of al-Shaddadi, where we had a couple of teen boys ride towards our lines on a motorbike, and motorbikes had been blowing up our lines left and right. And where I had my Kalashnikov off safe, ready to rock and roll, the YPG kind of took the lead on situations like that. Would be like, hold on, let's see what's going on, and they dealt with the individuals, and then you had guys like myself ready, expecting this is where we're going to get hit because mm-hmm. this is our vulnerability, kids and women, and then gratefully, nothing came out of that situation. And then I remember clicking my Kalashnikov off safe, and then everyone heard the sound of that, and the YPG, everyone looked at me like, okay. And then it was kind of refreshing in a sense. I felt like they looked at me like, what are you doing? And I felt like I looked back at them like, I'm watching your backs. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, to me, it sounds like it puts you in a tough situation because, as you say, if motorbikes are their weakness and they're getting hit, then maybe that conversational attitude is why they keep on getting hit by motorbikes. And just because in this one instance it doesn't happen, mm-hmm. you know what I mean? It like reinforces this idea. See, we can, you know what I mean? Like but by the same token, this time it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So. Not that you look like the asshole, but you're like, oh, what, look at this hyper aggressive dude. It's like, yeah, but we keep on getting hit by motorbikes.
Yeah. So that was, I'd say, a conflict we had in cultures.
Yeah.
For me, being a former Marine and having learned from the Marines before me, it's you give slack to someone, and that's where where the mistakes happen.
Right.
So, but the YPG were more nurturing and less aggressive, and so there was a balance, and I felt like we kind of respected each other,
right?
And it worked out for the most part. Yeah,
right.
And just for people who are unfamiliar, because I don't know if we brought it up before, the YPG is the female equivalent of the YPG.
Yes.
The women's militia is, like Baz was pointing out, mm-hmm. They're separate.
Yes.
Completely.
Yep.
Sorry. They're completely separate. They have their own command structure, own training facilities, own vehicles. own weapon caches.
One of you wrote about an experience in the book where when the YPG came in and liberated areas, they would get a more hostile response. But when the YPJ came in and liberated areas, like people saw what Baz was talking about, that like if the women are this free, then you're not coming here to like oppress us.
No, that's a difference between, like, it's the Middle East, you know, you have like, there's wars constantly and there's guys telling local population, oh, we're the good guys, you're free now. And obviously they're not. And then you have like a truck, like you have a truck come into a village that was until, 30 minutes ago under ISIS rule for the last 3 years.
Right.
And the truck is packed with 12 women driving their own car,
with Kalashnikovs,
with AKs, with PKMs, with RPGs, just securing the village, going, all right, women, you're safe now.
Yeah.
And these local women that just got liberated,
Right.
they understood this political theory in an instant.
Right.
And frankly, like it's quite funny when you saw, like, we talked about the river crossing, and like when John went over there with the Zodiacs, I would go later. My ambulance and my team would be brought over by a SEAL team on this little pontoon. But I would just shoot the shit until it was our turn with some MASOC guys waiting there. And I would talk about the YPG, and I was like, oh yeah, she, referring to one of the commanders, she has like tons of confirmed kills with a Druganov 3 times, with a standard 3x scope. She was a sniper, and they're like, holy cow. Like, and later all the special forces guys, like actually force multiplying with the Kurdish forces during the battle, they loved the YPG for what they were.
Yeah.
Because of what they contributed to the conflict and how they changed the conflict. And let me give you one other example. It's a conflict where sexual violence, especially against women, but also men, was part of the conflict, right? Daesh would have like rape houses.
Right.
It's ridiculous. Like all of these things, like all of these, and then you have the YPG on the other side. It's like, holy cow. Like if there was ever good versus evil, that obvious, it's right here.
Yeah.
Like the locals knew immediately that they are safe. And like not a single international volunteer I know has come across any sexual abuse by anyone, because there's armed women. A third of the fighting force is armed women.
Right.
And you don't want to mess with them.
Right.
Like there's this one instant where me and Sean stand in the middle of a desert in 2015 during one of the operations, and like 3 trucks of our Arab allies come in, and they were like former al-Nusra guys. They had like African dudes with this massive like swords on their backs and big beards, and they see 2 Westerners standing there alone without a vehicle in this little village, and it was like, holy fuck, what's gonna happen now? Like Sean and I were like slowly taking the safety of the AK, and it was like, fuck, this is not good. And then the YPG woman, a commander, walks out of a hut, like drinking a chai or something, and just telling the al-Nusra guys to fuck off, and they did. Because the YPG had a reputation in that war, and the Islamists didn't want to mess with them.
I remember some of the American Special Forces guys telling me about Rajda, and like how much respect Rajda Falat had on the battlefield, and that there were like entire Arab battalions that she was commanding, which is it's surreal. It's completely surreal, and especially in that part of the world.
But it's the Middle East, right? You need to bleed and have casualties in order to be taken serious.
Right.
Like Westerners made it into the fight once we had enough casualties. It's a brutal logic, but that's how it works. Like once we had enough casualties in shaheeds, KIAs, we were taken serious as a part of the alliance, and it was the same with the YPG.
Yeah.
Like these Islamists probably fought the YPG before they switched side and defected, essentially, and they know what they're like. And it's like most of the international volunteers you'll talk to love the YPG for being vigilant, more vigilant than the YPG, more disciplined than the YPG, because the women had more to lose and more to gain in that war.
Right.
For the men, it was just yet another war and an endless series of battles.
Right.
For the YPG, it was about freedom.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the amount of like human trafficking and everything going on from
Jesus.
from ISIS, from Daesh was it was unworldly, right?
And it spread like, look, it spread like, let's not make a secret out of it. All this human trafficking, all this abuse, it spread from ISIS into the UN camps. Like,
Right.
you know, in the UN-run refugee camps, you would have rich Arabs from Lebanon fly in and buy children and shit.
Right.
Like, it was dark.
And
And
when
then
I
there's the YPG. You know, if there's any abuse, well,
Yeah.
they take you behind the building and put lead into your back,
Yeah.
in the back
And-
of your head.
And when
That's
I say human trafficking, like I don't mean to minimize it because it really is women and child trafficking. You know, it's like we say human trafficking, but we're really focusing on the women and children that are being trafficked and under Daesh and
Yeah.
other forms of that. Yeah.
Let's
Yes.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to complete the Manbij story. After you got to the other side of the river, to circle back around on that and the subsequent battle that you guys fought in. So, what happened on the other side of the Euphrates?
So once we crossed and all the boats left, and gratefully we hadn't taken contact. It was very confusing in the beginning. Even the Marsoc guys, they when we were leading up to the river crossing, when we were floating out in the Euphrates, I had asked them, "Are they taking contact?" And they said, "We don't know." But I could hear their radios. It was going wild. But he said, "We don't know." So I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be crazy. But once we crossed, and then they took off. It was fairly safe. We hadn't taken contact. But the YPG EOD guys, aka Sabotage, came in, and then they had to clear an entire strip so we can start moving forward.
Right.
So that's what they did. I remember we had taken cover. We were looking up at these mountains, and I was on the I suppose the opposite side of what appeared to be a concrete bridge. And I had my back against it, and then the Sabotage guys had gone up left and right to clear or to check for and clear any mines. And then maybe an hour or two later, we were given the green light to continue up our path, which ended up being, I suppose, up the side of a mountain that I would assume you wouldn't expect mines to be planted in. So we spent, from that moment, we spent about 24 hours just going, clearing that one mountain pass, and then going from mountain to mountain, clearing, pretty much doing everything a Marine hopes to do. You do an amphibious landing, and then you clear this mountaintop, this hilltop, then you assault that one, and then you go to the next, and you go to the next, and you just go from mountain to mountain, and that's what we did for the essentially the first 48 hours.
And were these areas, were they strongholds? Is that why you're going through them? Was there fierce resistance throughout those mountains?
There was not fierce resistance. I'm under the impression we chose that pass, because it was the narrowest to cross the Euphrates. And as the Marsoc guys had told me before we crossed, they said, "Hey, we haven't seen any movement on the other side in weeks." So I assume, the SOCOM guys, they looked and said, "Hey, this is probably the safest path to take, and we're going to take it." And then we hopped. When we were doing mountain to mountain, we did come across certain bunkers, where ISIS had clearly dug in prior to us getting in there, and then but we had thrown frags. We had we did what we have to do to clear those bunkers before we move forward.
Right.
And to my surprise, we hadn't come across any ISIS guys.
Could you still hear AC-130 flying overhead?
Constantly.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I feel like AC-130, once somebody knows what that sounds like, it's a huge motivation to get out of the area.
Yes.
It's the most wonderful sound
is, isn't it?
to me until today. Like,
it really is.
In the early days of the conflict, we would we would hold the extended overstretched line, 6 guys, 1 village. And when the AT-130 suddenly shows up, we were like, fuck. And they were like just pounding the enemy. And it was just wonderful.
Yeah.
Them and the
whole Kurdish front line was like, oof, being like relieved for this moment, at least when it's dark. And the enemy had the momentum until then, right?
Yeah.
And but once the Kurds and the Americans started their close alliance, ISIS withdrew to the cities. They gave up the countryside because they can't hold.
There's no place to hide from AC. Yeah.
We would like. Yeah, the very first operation, into the caliphate, pushing the bastards back. I would remember we would just drive through the desert, and we would see these half-dark bunkers with charcoal bodies in them. Like they weren't ready for US airstrikes. And then that was 2015. So I'd say in March 2015, America just bombed ISIS suddenly in Syria. And then in summer 2016, the Kurds had the airstrike app on the tablet. They just made peep and a bomb dropped.
Yeah.
Like ISIS gave up the countryside. They had the usual village idiots there to hold the line and slow things down, mess things up. They had mines, IEDs, all of that. But the fight was the cities.
It's funny because, and we've had, we've had people from the AC community on here before and we've talked about it. And for those of you who don't know, you have jets come in and you're like, you hear it and it drops the stuff. But with an AC, it's like a muffled lawnmower that you hear constantly because it's a rotary wing. It's flying low altitude. You can hear it. And it's sort of like when the bad guys hear the AC just overhead, it's like when you're trying to break into somebody's house and you hear a shotgun racking. It's like, okay, I'll pick someplace else, right?
Them and the A-10s were doing God's work over there.
Yeah, the A-10s, man. Jesus.
Yeah, I love the brrrt sound.
I
have the good recording of one. I like without the A-10s and the AC-130s, I wouldn't be sitting here. I can tell you that.
Yeah,
like it was without US airstrikes, I wouldn't be alive.
Yeah, what happened with the Manbij battle from your perspective, Bill?
Well, I was like at that point, I was just made the commander of the YPG's or SDF's first combat medic unit. Right, we had this. Me and a buddy found this shot up ambulance on a scrapyard and fixed it up, and we had a Nissan minivan or something, and we would run like this combat medic team with a bunch of American guys. And anyways, like the guys elected me for their leader, as you do in the militia. Funnily enough, the geography teacher. There were a few American veterans, but whatever. I was just chilling, waiting to cross the bridge to Manbij. So ISIS had blown up the last third of the bridge. So 2/3 on our side were still good. So I would just bring my ambulance on there. My guys are just drinking like the 3-in-1 Syrian coffees, chatting with the Masok guys, and then eventually we would be called like. And then there was like mine injuries, blah, 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 contact. So they wanted the medics over. So we would drive on the pontoon segment. And then it was like a SEAL team who had like Zodiacs on both sides and was just shuttling it back and forth. It would be like about 6 Hiluxes or 2 tanks on this float that would bring us over. And then we would go towards the battle. And then it was like, I said, like the ISIS gave up the countryside. So it was like fairly easy getting, advancing, not much happening. And then the closer we got to the city, more Americans came out, more French special forces came out. The Brits came out, although they kept saying they were Americans. Well, until we would hang out with them. And I'm like, oh, come on, man. I studied in the UK. I know you. I know where you're from. And then they dropped the act. But and
the Americans were saying they were Brits or whatever. Yeah. Everybody trying to hide their involvement.
Yeah, something like that. Exactly. We would get, the closer we'd get to the city, the tenser it would get. Tension would build up, and yeah, it was like clear to everyone that this is going to get very dark very soon. And it did. As soon as we reached Manbij, the outskirts, it was like a fairly large city for the region. And ISIS had spent years fortifying it. Like later sabotage would find, like in the perimeter houses around the city, they would find like 23, 25 IEDs in one building.
Wow.
Everywhere, under the buildings, under the doormats, under the carpets, behind the curtains, everywhere. There were mines everywhere, and we couldn't get into the city. Like we would try to get into the city, and the bastards would push us out, and we would take casualties, like World War I style. So very soon, like we were overwhelmed. Like my medic team was completely and utterly overwhelmed, and very soon the Americans that were based with Kurdish command and control, which was just behind the fighting. So you had like these central hubs just behind the fighting, where troops would rotate in and out of the fighting. The fuel truck would get there, logistics would get there with food. So it was kind of these central hubs. Around the city of Manbij, you had like 5 to 6 of these hubs behind the fighting, and this is where Western special forces would deploy with Kurdish command or SDF command and control to force multiply, meaning calling in airstrikes, mortaring, and then pretty quickly also helping with the casualties of war they got out. And so as soon as we hit the city, and as soon as the first units tried to breach, it was a nightmare. Like these units would get like casualty rates of 50, 60, 70%. So many of these units would be like 16-year-old kids of both sexes being sent into this meat grinder, into these minefields with no training, not enough ammo, no medical supplies. Like the only medical supplies they had were like tourniquets my team produced on the bazaar with like locally, like we manufactured them locally. We basically reverse engineered the cat tourniquets. We would hand out like these stiff plastic thingies and duct tape to improvise chest seals and shit. There was nothing. And it was just devastating. And then as soon as the special forces guys realized the scale of things, like their medics would rotate in, work with us. And then at times the whole special forces team would help out when we had mass casualty events, especially with civilians, right? Because ISIS had in Manbij had about 50,000 human hostages, civilians in the city, and they wouldn't let them out. So any civilian that would try to flee the caliphate, the city, would be seen as a traitor and be punished. So in their desperation, and these people didn't have any food, they didn't have water because Daesh confiscated it all. So they were desperate. They were starving. The children were starving. And once in a while, you had a group so desperate that they would try to run through the minefields and the ring of snipers ISIS had set up. And you had events with like 40 injured civilians, children, women mainly. And it's like these special forces medics were like, what the fuck is going on here?
Well, how did you guys extract them from that hostile fire zone if they got wounded in the minefield and in from snipers?
Yeah, well, sometimes they crawled out, sometimes other forces got them out, sometimes we dragged them out, and you run in, grab them, and fuck off as fast as possible, and you get them out, and you try to get them to the next facility where they can be stabilized, which was 2 hours, 3 hours away, and that was Kobani Hospital, again under sanctions. The docs did the best they can, but yeah, so like really early after the day we reached the city, we had like an American with a round through the neck coming out the mouth. We had like it was dark, and like after a week, these special forces medics like came to us and was like, "Holy fuck, guys! Like we packed, and based on our experience, we packed supplies for a month.
Yeah,
we ran out. We are here since a week, and we ran out.
Yeah,
like I remember one of the special forces medics always going like, "Fuck! I should have brought my GoPro. This is like in this 1 week, I've seen everything from our training manuals.
Yeah,
for training purposes, we should have just recorded that. It was." Yeah, it was just a medieval warfare with snipers and like a besieged city with mines and snipers. It's very, very brutal.
I talked to one American volunteer over there, YPG volunteer, and he said a Navy SEAL medic sewed his penis back together on the Manbij battle. You know who I'm talking
Yeah.
about?
Kato.
Yeah.
We got him out. We got
Yes.
him out.
Yeah.
Yep. We never talked about it publicly, but since you bring it up,
Well, that's a party trick, right?
I've heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy.
Yeah.
Kato.
Sure, yeah.
John, during this, like, what was your experience? Because you guys had hit these mountains and then you were approaching the city, right? So, what did you guys experience from the combative side?
So with my Tabor, aka platoon, slowly but surely we were being hacked away. Every night or day operation, slowly but surely, we had about a squad worth of people being hacked away. I was lucky. I had the night shift. We had survived. We got through the mountains, and then I remember one day in particular where it was very difficult. We had to get from the mountains down into a village to where we eventually would mount up to vehicles and then get to the next village. It was very odd. It was I suppose early in the offensive, so there was lots of mortars going on, incoming, but we weren't getting hit very much. We had the YPG. They had gotten hit on one of the mountains that they were on. I suppose a dash vehicle had infiltrated our lines and had opened up with the Dushka, which is basically the Russian 50 cal.
50 cal, yeah.
Yes, and then we had taken at least one casualty from there, to where I remember the YPG had to put her on a stretcher and then hump her out of there, and she survived, luckily. But from what I can remember, as we made our way through the mountains, we made our way into the country, or I suppose the outer limits of the Manbij city. Yeah, outer limits of Manbij. We encountered I suppose counterintelligence, or we had encountered civilians that were sided with Daesh, that were trying to lead us in the wrong direction, and that was immediate. I remember in particular, immediately we had missed our armored vehicle ride, our rendezvous out in some fields, so we had to hump it out to a Hilux. That brought us into a compound, and then we made our way into a compound, taking fire, hearing vehicles going left, going right, and then when we were in that compound, I had heard the YPG or YPG opening up somewhere to my 12 o'clock, where I was off on the left flank, providing security. Didn't have anything coming that way, and it turned out what was going on at the 12 o'clock was there was what would be understood as a village elder approaching our lines holding a baby. But it turned out, and he was approaching us, waving his hands, and the YPG was saying, "No, stop, stop," and he kept approaching us. And then they had opened fire on this individual, and then he had gone down, and it turned out the baby he was holding was an IED, and then he had blown himself up once he had gone down.
That happened quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
These things. Yeah. Like we were sent, my medic team was once sent to this compound on some civilian family's farm outside Manbij, and like we knew, like me and my buddy, we sensed immediately something is off with these guys. Like they're not on our side. So we were like, yeah, sure, we got on that building, blah blah blah, and then we fucked off the other way around, and like 5 minutes later, a V-bit drove into that particular building. The asshole blew itself up in an empty building, but that happened quite frequently.
Yeah.
That locals would try to lure you into a trap, and then ISIS would come with a V-bit or something.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough in those scenarios because, like, the idea of the caliphate wasn't like there were a lot of people who were in favor of that idea of an Islamic caliphate, right? That and that ISIS was, and sometimes they were also under duress to do this stuff. Like it's hard to tell. Like, is their family being held hostage and they're being forced to do this? Like, you never know what somebody's motives are, and nobody's wearing a uniform, so you know who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. Is this person on a cell phone just talking on the cell phone, or are they setting off an IED underneath your vehicle?
Yes, and there was all these stories about many of the V-bits being actually driven by like some family dad whose family was taken hostage.
Right.
And these guys wouldn't detonate their V-bit. They were just told drive there, and then some ISIS guy from the distance would remote detonate it.
Yeah.
Right. So once American special forces and the Brits started jamming the frequencies, some of these V-bits didn't go off anymore because it was just an average Joe in there pressed into the ranks.
Yeah.
John, speaking of being lured into a trap, you want to tell us this story? One of the scariest stories is when your Tabor got lured into this village and ambushed.
Sure, yeah. So once we crossed over into ISIS lines in Manbij, so we had been leading up to the city up until this point, and from what I understand, ISIS had a perimeter. Like, we're moving into inner city Manbij from this point, and that we had a night operation, my favorite, to where we're gonna move out from this one nokta, this one point, and then cross over the berm that ISIS had built with their own bulldozers. They had dug out the berm, built it up, and we were the first to penetrate it. So we left from this one nokta in the middle of the night, and we had made our way up to the berm, and then I had heard the C-130s hammering away targets, and we got the green light to cross, and so that's what we did. So myself, my battle buddy Danny, we were the first, I'd say, within the first 3 people to cross over the berm into ISIS territory in Manbij. It was Danny, myself, and our team leader, which was YPG, commander, I guess. So we made our way over the berm, no problem, nothing. And then everyone else followed us over, and then we had congregated on the backside of a building. So we crossed over the berm, hopped over the little ditch that had been built as part of the berm, and congregated on the backside of a building, ready to move into inner city Manbij. And we had done that, and we had moved forward, and I remember we hadn't received any resistance at this point. We had heard the C-130 overhead hammering targets, but had zero intel. Didn't know if they were hammering motorbike drivers, didn't know if they saw anyone on rooftops, didn't know if they saw anything. But we heard them hammering targets as we were maneuvering. So we maneuvered to this first building, and then we continue to a building that I'll call Nokta 1, which is basically point 1. We had moved to this one building. It was a compound. It had there were 3 front doors to this building. 2 of the front doors were not built into it, So it was like 2/3 of this building where they were working on but didn't finish. But a third of the building had been finished. And so we got there, and then the 1/3 of the building that had been finished, I coincidentally had heard a female cough as we were going underneath the window. I remember hearing it, and I was watching it, and I reported it to my squad leader, who is a fresh squad leader, because our squad leader before us had been relieved. And I told him, hey, I heard something in this window. And then we cleared those other 2 doorways. We went into the building. It was basically abandoned. Just as most of the buildings in Syria, they had been, people had stopped working on them once the civil war kicked off. So we had cleared 2/3 of the buildings. We went up multiple floors up to the rooftop. And our squad leader had called it in as Nokta Yak, point 1, to the American, which I assume that's going to the Americans. So this is Nokta Yak. This is point 1 since we made the breach into Daesh territory. And then we cleared the building, came downstairs, but there was still the doorway on the far right side. The 3 doorways. It was the far doorway on the far right side that we hadn't cleared, and the door was closed. So I don't know why we didn't clear that doorway. I pointed out. I said, "Hey," to my commander, my squad leader, pointed out, "Hey, that's the doorway. That's most likely where I heard the cough coming from. It was the right side of the house, which would have aligned with the window that I had heard the cough come from." But he said, "No problem. We're just gonna continue going." So it felt like a movie moment in a sense, where I'm looking at this doorway and I'm like, "This is where I heard the cough." We hadn't had any intelligence before then. I said, "I know someone's in here. I don't know what that cough was. It could have been, best case scenario, a woman just coughing. Worst case scenario, a Daesh wife saying, 'Hey, we have some people outside.'" So it was it was one of those situations with the Kurds where you have to say, "Fuck it," and then you just move on with the next. So it was that situation. So I was just like, "Oh, okay, all right, you don't care. All right, we're moving forward." So from there, from Nokta Yak, we move forward, and we move into what I perceived as a square, a town square type of situation. Like, we had to cross over a broken cinder block wall, and then we walked into an olive grove, which at the end of the olive grove, you had basically a town square. You had an intersection, a 4-way intersection, and it was filled with buildings that were basically abandoned in their construction. All the way around 360, it was just abandoned buildings, open windows, and that's, we had approached the intersection, and that's where I had heard someone above me in a window. I heard the ever familiar sound of a cinder block being kicked. Like just a basic cinder block being kicked along a concrete floor. I had heard that, and I thought, "Oh, shit." So I brought that to my squad leaders. I said, "Hey, I heard that." And then he was, I suppose he was trying to process what was going on. I said, "Hey, I heard something up here," but I could only assume, due to the previous situation where I said, "Hey, I heard someone cough," and we didn't find anybody, but also we hadn't got into their section of the house, he didn't take it too seriously. But my battle buddy at the time, Danny, he said, "John, did you see that red light?" And I said, no. And I thought, fuck. This is it. Because the red lens, the red lens moonbeam,
Yeah.
it's military. It's game on.
Right.
So he said that, and I said, no, I hadn't seen it when he was looking, and I'm trying to communicate with my squad leaders what was going on in this window, and he saw that, and I had it, and I said, oh, no, I didn't, but it's game on. So I had to switch arms, ready to rock and roll, watching this window, and the squad leader decided the squad is we're gonna push forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I was tail end Charlie in the squad, and the front started moving, and then now I'm looking out in the square, watching the windows, because I'm like, all right, something's in here. I don't know what it is. It could be a civilian, like we had just heard, or it could be a dash guy waiting to blow my head out.
Is your squad leader walking through the square or around the side of the square?
Through it with the squad.
Hey, diddle straight up the middle.
Yep. Yeah, he was a squad leader due to like ideological alignment rather than like combat experience. So I had heard that, and then we're moving forward. So now I'm watching forward and also keeping awareness with the guy that I know is right above my head in this window. And as the front steps out, I hear the sound of an AK taking fire. And I know, and then in my head, it all happened in slow motion. In my head, I'm like, okay, no one said anything about our guys being, like, I can hear that, it's going somewhere. No one had told us anything about YPG or YPG people being in this house. It's game on. So, I was on patrol, with the Kalashnikov, the safety is on the right side.
Yeah.
So I would, when I would go out on patrol, it would be on kill. And then would be my safety. So I had heard that, and it just all clicked. I just opened up I looked up, saw a male with his left forearm and his Kalashnikov sticking out of the window of a third floor window, shooting at the front of the patrol. So I opened up on him, and I'd say I unloaded about half a magazine before he disappeared.
He got a lead salad.
I'd like to believe so. He disappeared from the window, and then I stopped to take in what's going on. The fog of war kind of settled for a second, and I realized I was by myself, and I nobody else was shooting back. I was by myself, and I knew there was someone above me at the same time. So while I was engaging the person at the third floor, I was also watching the window right above my head, waiting for someone to pop out, looking to pop me, and then hopefully I'd pop him. So the fog of war cleared, and I realized I was by myself. And I kind of, I ducked back into my right side, which was an alleyway in between this building and the building behind us. And I started yelling for my battle buddy, Danny.
Mm-hmm. Danny's watching right now, just so you know. Yeah. Danny's on, yeah.
Alrighty. Well, so I called for Danny. Nothing the first time, and I was thinking, oh, not good. So I called him again, and I'm watching all of these windows on the side of this cinder block building. And then sure enough, I hear Danny. He says, he responds, and I say, Danny, come to me. And then it takes him a second. I'm watching these windows, but it takes him a second. I believe he was somewhere on the front porch of this house.
Yeah.
And
is that when the conversation goes, fuck you, you come to me? Like,
close, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it goes, right?
Yeah. straight up Black Hawk Down vibes. And he hadn't come, and I was like, Danny, where are you? And then he pops out of nowhere around the side of the building, and he just hops down. I'm like, come on. Like, we got to get out of here. So he comes around, and we back our way up from this one building in front of us. We back our way around a building behind us into an olive grove that was kind of shielding us. So I remember taking a knee and talking to Danny and be like, all right, dude, we are fucked. And then we're trying to sort out what's going on, and we realize, like, the Kurds did just. Whoever had the Bisving, the RPG, left. Whoever had the 240, the PKM, left. And I'm like, all right, we can't move forward, just us two. We should our best bet is probably to move back and try to consolidate our force, try to figure out what's going on, and then find our strengths, and then move forward from there. We've got a building, as far as I know, filled with ISIS people that we barely just survived, and we don't want to move forward and mess around. We don't know what's going on there,
yeah.
And we don't know where our allies are. We might be doing a disservice by moving forward and aggravating the ISIS individuals in this house. So after a back and forth a little bit, Danny and I agree on we're gonna. It was my decision. I said I believe the best decision to make would be to pull back to Nokta, where the Americans had the grid. I said I think if we pull back there, I think the Americans naturally would send a drone around and check that grid just to see, okay, this is the last coordinates that we know the Kurds cleared. Mm-hmm. Is it still clear? So I said, I think that's the best way to go. Back to Nokta and hold that down. Also, because pulling back further than that would be pulling back prior to the breach.
Yeah, outside of the village. Yeah, right.
Yes.
Right.
Outside of ISIS lines.
Right.
And I thought if we do that, we are everyone who tries to move forward after us is fucked.
Right.
Because it's going to be daytime, and they're just going to be they're dug in. ISIS is dug in, so we can't lose this breach.
Right.
So I said, let's pull back to Nokta and hold it down as long as we can, and just pray that the Americans can see us and tell the Kurds, hey, yeah, they are still at Nokta, send reinforcements.
Yeah.
So that was our agreement. And then when we had agreed to do that, I believe our Bisving gunner, the RPG gunner, had opened up on the building, in which case a unit behind us called 223, which was made up of mostly Americans, lots of Marines, and French Foreign Legionnaires. They had opened up on this building, which I believe marked it for airstrike very soon afterwards. But from there, Danny and I retreated, and our goal was to get back to Nokta.
Yeah.
To hold it down. And Danny and I had, in the process of getting back to Nokta, we had to cross the olive grove, and we got into a farmhouse. And while Danny and I were in that farmhouse trying to figure out where exactly we were compared to Nokta, because we didn't know the coordinates, we just knew visually what it looked like. And we had just passed it recently, but it was still the middle of the night.
Sure.
So we had gotten to a farmhouse, and we were going to try to get onto the roof to try to see, to orient ourselves. And we had heard Kurmanji being spoken outside of the house. And I had told Danny, okay, hey, I hear Kurdish being spoken. I was on the first floor, Danny was on the second floor. I said, I'm going to see what's going on. They're either going to shoot me or they're going to be friendlies, and they still might shoot me. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, no running passwords or anything like that, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It was the
Inshallah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like when Danny and I had met up, the issue with going back was I said they're more likely to shoot us
Right.
than the Dash guys in front of us. They
Right.
want to cut our heads off.
Right.
These guys behind us are just scared.
They don't want to get their heads cut off.
Yes.
Right.
So I was more scared about running backwards than I was about running forward. So when we're in this house, I heard it, and I was like, "Oh Jesus, please be YPG or YPG." So I opened the window, and it's YPG. And it's our Bisping gunner and our squad leader. So I'm like, Heval, Biani, which is foreigner, which is what the word that they gave us. So I communicate. I'm like, foreigner. And then they see me, and they're happy to see me. And then they come into the compound, and we kind of regroup. So now we've got myself, Danny, and then the squad leader with the radio, and the Bisping gunner.
But where's the rest? The squad leader left the rest of the
They
squad?
had to run off.
They left him.
Well, the story is the girl, or the YPG girl, with our PKM. And radio. Once we started taking contact, she had dumped her stuff and just took off running in her sandals. All the way back to the 223 base that I was too afraid to go back to because I thought we'd be shot.
Mm-hmm.
The story with her, she dumped the machine gun, dumped her radio, so Dash got her radio, and she ran all the way back across the berm. Back to 223 line.
So you guys just did a crypto roll, right?
Them, I assume.
Did they have crypto on the radios? Were they using that? No.
No, nothing. No. They had basically like off-the-shelf Walmart radios the whole time.
Right.
Yeah.
So
At least at the beginning, until
Yeah.
America stepped up the support, the material support.
I have to ask, especially, and I'm curious about the comments that you heard from other people you hadn't served, but Marine infantry training, like I liken it to Ranger training when it comes to infantry tactics. Like the Marine infantry training is no joke. It's very regimented. It's very fast. The squads are different than an infantry squad, but it's very rock and roll, right? And it's very formalized.
Absolutely.
Actually, no. You said absolutely. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The worst Marine I'd say could still lead a squad in combat.
Right.
Combat.
So how was it for you? Because I could see why a lot of Americans, especially like prior service Americans, would want to team up because maybe the tactics weren't always up to snuff in these YPG units you were in. Like, how did you guys manage that? Because you couldn't just take the lead. You couldn't like follow me.
Yeah.
How did you just like? Was there fatalism to it? Like, well, whatever happens, happens?
In a sense, in this part, what I was saying earlier about where we had reconnected with my squad leader with the radio, that was the important part. When we had reconnected with him, and we all reconvened in this compound, I had told him, I grabbed him and had told him, hey, this is, in my broken Kurdish, I said, you need to call the Havals and give them the coordinates for Nokta Yek. We're going back to Nokta 1, and we're going to hold it down, and you're going to call in reinforcements. Because it was also, I'd say, within 100 meters of the berm. Behind Nokta Yek, there was a building, and then behind Nokta Yek, within 100 meters, it probably was like within 50, to be quite honest. The berm was. And I said, we're going back to Nokta Yek because that's where I assume the Americans would be looking to see do we still have that one set of coordinates that they gave us.
And it's a hard point into the village that everybody else can use.
Yes. And I said, we're going back there. We're going to hold that down. And that he was on it. He got on the radio and he did everything I told him to do. And then we hold it down. And then we're there, and I'm looking around, and I'm kind of like, did you do what I think you did? Everything that I thought happened? And then sure enough, after like 40 minutes, I started seeing behind me, because I could see the route. I started seeing heads pop up over the berm, and I was like, "Oh my God, thank God, we're not about to die here.
Right.
We've got reinforcements coming."
Right.
And they were being sniped at because the sun had come up.
Right.
The sun had come up, and I'm watching them, and I'm thinking, and I can hear the sniper shots, and I can see them, and I'm like, "Oh my God, this is almost unbelievable."
Did you guys ever get back to checkpoint 1?
We were, at this point, we were at.
Did you
checkpoint
clear that
1
room?
holding it.
Did you clear that room? The room on the right? Wasn't that in the building? Like, wasn't that checkpoint 1, the room on the right that he didn't clear that you heard the cough from?
No, we didn't clear that part of the building. No, we did not. But where we were, the part of the building we cleared everything. That
Sure.
We could. Yeah.
So you guys did finally take Manbij. The war this war ground on into 2019, and there's this one line in the book that I thought was it says it all and also nothing at the same time, right? You write, eventually somewhere in the desert, the long war against ISIS ended. What do you guys want to say about the end of the war and how its conclusion? I mean, in some sense, it's still going on, right? But what was the conclusion of your war, John? And then we'll talk to, I know Baz kind of went into Mosul as well. What was the conclusion of the war for you on a personal level?
On a personal level, I would say the technical conclusion of Raqqa.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't there for that, but I know I followed it, and I suppose technically it was ended, but to be honest, I don't think it really was.
Yeah, how do you win a war against ideology, right? Or an ideal?
Yeah, I would even, personally, I would even go a bit further. I'd say the war didn't not end there, really. It kind of just set up the next war that's coming.
Right.
Because ultimately, by cracking down so hard on this, like after 2003, and like Saddam was a Sunni, ISIS were Sunni extremists, like cracking down on Sunni Islam in Iraq and Syria weakened the Sunnis so much that the Shia, aka Iran, is now taking over, and that's going to be the next one. Israel is not going to tolerate the Shia crescent from growing and growing and growing. And this is like I just signed a book deal for the next book on that, like how that is going to lead up to this conflict. Like Sunni Islam was so weakened that the Shia were finally able to implement the geopolitical vision, right? Creating a consistent Shia-controlled area. Or no, let me rephrase that. Connecting the Shia strongholds in like Lebanon and around Damascus with the Shia strongholds in southern Iraq and Iran. And what you have today is Shia militias controlling the Sunni deserts, which is an absolute nightmare for the future of the region. And what I would argue is that Rojava, America's mission with the Kurds, but also the other forces in SDF, in particular, the Sunni tribes along the Syrian-Iraqi border that are part of the SDF alliance and are part of America's proxy. That's one of the last frontiers, and I drew a map of this. Like it's basically creating the last chokehold to a complete Shia crescent in the region. And that fact, so you have Rojava along the Iraqi-Syrian border with the Sunni tribes as part of the alliance. And then around the Jordanian border, you have this Al-Tanf mysterious mission where where America wants to create safe haven for refugees. But it's like apparently 200 special forces there. It's an anti-Iranian mission. So basically at this point, America narrows down, and this one bit, they narrow down the Shia crescent to 2 border crossings. And without Rojava, without SDF, Iran wins. The whole Syrian-Iraqi border would be suddenly open to Iranian influence, and that's going to be the next war.
And
it's going to be
any Americans who wonder why we still have American forces in Syria, it's still special forces guys over there. I thought this war was about ISIS. What are they still doing over there? Well, you just offered the perfect answer.
Yes. You don't fight. Look, like after Trump announced we were withdrawing from Rojava, the next day went like, oh no, we're not. We're coming back with Abrams tanks. Well, you don't need Abrams tanks against sleeper cells. You need Abrams tanks to deter Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. That's what they're for, in my opinion. And again, like I've been there, I've been hanging out with these Iranians in Mosul.
Tell us about that, Baz. About you were there for the Battle of Mosul with the Shia
Yeah, it was
militias.
for the Battle of West Mosul, like when it kicked off, it was very weird. We were like it was like, you guys know this, I was missing war, right? And then this dude would came up and said, I want to go to Mosul, do some medical stuff. I was, yeah, sure. So we flew to Mosul, and there were a few Americans there that set up things and yada yada yada. It was like me and a bunch of other guys, and we didn't have any Americans on the team. So it's like, okay, you guys go with Iraqi Armed Forces 9th Division. I'm like, sure. Turns out Iraqi's 9th Division was in the Shia militia-controlled desert west of Mosul. So while there was fighting in the city and fighting in like other cities around it, the Shia militias would advance in the countryside and just take it. They didn't care about the cities. They would be after the highways, the roads leading, especially from east to west, and they would hold them with their proxies. And like I was there my team was under the protection of the Iraqi forces, so we would be just driving around after a few weeks in our own Hilux, just dealing with the Iranians, dealing with Quds. Like there were Quds Force guys that they worked their way through kill lists right next to us. And like no American, this was a place where Americans couldn't necessarily go. Like the Americans, one of your airborns was there and they would just rush through in armored convoys with these Iranians just spitting in front of the AMRAPs and shit. And they run the show. It was very clear that these guys run the show. The Iraqi special forces with US aid were liberating Mosul and dying there in like ridiculous numbers. The Shia militias just grabbed the countryside between the cities.
Right.
And they were like, we were there when they started conducting these hearts and minds missions. On the one hand, you would have like informants with balaclavas selecting ISIS suspect from the refugees from the city. The Quds Force would drive them in the desert and come back with an empty truck, all of that shit. And then at the same time, you would have like Shia imams from like Najaf in the south come up and distributing baklava and candy to like the refugees.
Oh,
yeah, it's one Iraq. We welcome you. Blah, blah, blah. It was a very brutal carrot and stick approach.
Yeah,
where Iran took control of these deserts.
Yeah.
And like I couldn't stay there for long because it wasn't my war. Like I'm a German intellectual. I don't want to talk about a second Holocaust with Iranians. That's not what I enjoy. And it was getting a bit messy. We get asked by like Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, UN, to collect intel there, and you start taking pictures of things you don't want to take pictures of, and you have your thing, you know, and it's like we weren't spying for anyone, but we didn't want any informants see us with the UN. And then next day next to the Quds Force, like I didn't enjoy that conflict, although it was exciting. But it was a completely different war, even though it was the same enemy at the same time.
Right. How do the Kurds feel about like NATO and the UN, being that really it's you know, Turkey's involvement with the West that keeps the Kurds kind of from being formalized, right? Or am I wrong?
Yes, no, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Short answer, the Kurds love the Americans. Like historically, American foreign policy did betray the Kurds quite a few times.
Sure.
The Kurds absolutely love the Americans there. Absolutely love them, because they know if America becomes the Kurdish hegemon and has this like protecting hands, wings in form of the, various jets and drones over Kurdistan prospers. Mm-hmm. If America withdraws, the Islamists, the Assads, the Turks, angry dudes with beards take over and squash the revolution. Like, I think at this point, the Kurds are strong enough because of Western support. Like, talk to people in Rojava. It's one big tunnel. You don't want to go in there as a Turkish military, as a conscript army. The Kurds learned a lot from ISIS's urban guerrilla fighting. They have the right equipment to defend themselves, and yet it needs America to secure Kurdistan. That's the reality of things. Without America, the Kurds aren't around anymore.
Since the Battle of Mosul and the fall of Raqqa, a lot has changed in Rojava. There have been some Turkish incursions. I was wondering if you could at least somewhat briefly give us a sort of status update on where this region is today.
Well, Rojava is being surrounded by its enemies that want to squeeze it. Iran wants it because they want America out. Like US installations are being mortared in Rojava from Shia militias. It's also a place where American Kurdish patrols bump into Russian patrols on a daily basis or bi-daily basis. I know that the Kurds have very loose rules of engagement. So it's like Manbij, which I think in 2020, Manbij fell back to the regime and the Russians. And I think John and I almost got a heart attack. After all this dying, we just gave it to the fucking Russians.
Yeah.
I couldn't, I was furious. I couldn't believe it. But I guess a lot of US servicemen and women that served in the Middle East know that feeling. Anyways, but it's the enemies of this freedom project, of this democracy project, are pushing in from the north, from the east, from the west, and the south. And frankly speaking, I doubt that policymakers in Washington understand what they have in Rojava. I doubt that it's their last possible foothold, justified foothold in this part of the Middle
organic
East.
Democratic movement in the Middle East in a viable partner force.
Yeah, once you're out of there, you lost the Middle East, north of Jordan.
I want to talk a little bit about life after war for the two of you. John, what was your kind of homecoming like? What was it like coming back to all of this?
Well, I plugged right back into my. I've got a security company out in California. So as soon as I came back, I plugged right back into there. Kind of, for the most part, pretended like Syria never existed. Just went right back into business. Completely ignored everything that had taken place in Syria. And to be quite honest, it worked out for me for the most part. I eventually got to process everything months down the road, maybe closer to a year. But when I came back, I had business to handle. So I just plugged right back into that. All of the trauma, all of the negativity from being in Rojava, it was just pushed to the side. And then on my clock, when I was ready for it, I processed it. So
what caused you to leave? When did you decide? Was there a point when you said, "I'm going home"? It's over for me.
I'd say after Manbij, I did the combat part of Manbij, and then I also volunteered on Boz's medical team. But once my time was done, I felt like at least my time in the war to that point, I felt like I fulfilled my commitment.
Yeah.
Which technically I kind of did. I had
it was like a 6 month tour, so to speak, right?
Yeah, that second time was a 6-month commitment. So
did you feel that you got what you were missing when you left the Marine Corps in terms of that combat that was out there that you probably joined for?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. I felt like I brought something at least to the volunteer group, that I would not have been able to bring to combat or to a conflict zone in the Marine Corps. Granted, and going back on a MU.
Still working security company out in California?
Yes, but I also transferred to Tampa.
Okay.
The University of Tampa to finish out my degree in political science.
Cool.
International studies, So I finished that in January.
Awesome.
So once I do that, my goal is to get back into the field just as a humanitarian rather than a combatant. So,
Well, we should connect you with Ryan Hendrickson.
Yeah. And also Andy.
Oh yeah, yeah. Ryan is a former special forces soldier who lost a leg in Afghanistan, and he's over in Ukraine right now doing humanitarian stuff. He's handing out bags of rice to people. He's doing demining like
Savage.
UXO. He's doing really good stuff over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I'd like to do. I got to see what it's like going into those places. When you're doing it holding a rifle, you're on one side of the line. But when you're over there, like, when I came back from Syria, I went to EMT school and have done some EMT work. And I got to see what it's like being on the other side of the line where you're not the bad guy. You're just trying to help.
Right.
And I like that. So that's what I'd like to do, moving forward.
And how about you, Till? I mean, after all of this chaos and insanity, what was it like trying to return back home?
Yeah, I mean, it's like different to most guests on your show. I wasn't trained for any of this stuff, right? I didn't have any military training, didn't have any training in leadership, in medical, like combat medicine. And I couldn't ignore it. Like, I saw so many friends, like we had so many friends die under our hands. We had so many children like die under my responsibility. And like with these mass chaos events, like I had to pull my medics of kids, of children that were dead, and they wanted to do CPR. And I was like, no, you can't. Like, it's dead. We need to move on. Work with that. These images about if you have 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds running through minefields, their skin is just ripped off the body. Like these images of seeing in the back of a kid, like the back being open, the lungs trying to work, but couldn't. And then we just tape it with duct tape because we didn't have materials like this. Like I couldn't shake it. So my best response was like, after 2 tours in Rojava, fuck it, I go to Mosul and do more like Wild West stuff. Get some medical supplies on the bazaar, buy some AKs on the black market, and just lag it. Just go and see if we can drag a few kids out of shit. And I realized, like, in this desert in Mosul, like when you start yelling at like Shia proxy forces for being fucking idiots, it's time to leave. You overstay your welcome. And eventually even the Abrams tanks of the 9th Division can't really kind of protect you once it's like, yeah, fuck it. I gotta get out. And like, honestly, I fucked my academic career with this time there. To many of my former colleagues, I'm a combatant in a very bloody war. They don't shake my hands. They don't respond to my emails. I moved to Canada, basically, get married here, and live in a forest and write about these things and think. And yeah, that's basically
and you said
me.
the United States government won't even let you in the country because of your association, so to speak, with the Iranians.
Yeah, I think they just didn't know what to, like, most people don't know where to put me, where to place me, in what box to put me. I'm not this German academic anymore, the suburban kid. I'm like American veteran. I can talk much easier these days to American combat vets than to fellow academics, because of my experience and what I did. So for me, the best way to deal with it is live in the moment, enjoy life, and be happy to be alive. Be happy that the sun shines every day and that I'm not dead yet. And that I can do at best in a semi-off-grid life in the Canadian wilderness. I feel in the city, I can't really be in the moment. It's just stress and traffic and appointments, and so I'm still I don't have any of these post-PTSD symptoms, but I'd say I have PTS, like I have post-traumatic stress. I saw horrible things. I wasn't trained for it, and I need to make sense of them.
Sure.
It doesn't mean I have a disorder. I'm perfectly fine. But and yet it impacts me, right?
Yeah.
And yet I need to make sense of it from an academic perspective, and I need to rationalize it. And I need to rationalize what we did and what we didn't do and what we could do and we couldn't do. And yeah, I mean, many veterans know that you make decisions in split seconds and then you have the rest of your life to think about it, right? So like when John talked about this ambush, like I still remember like half of his team got fucked up, and specifically, you know, this old Russian APC would bring out some of the casualties to my medic team where we would rush in. And I remember like we had our minivan, I would just drag all of our supplies out, make it a second improvised ambulance. We shove everyone in there, stabilize them, shove them in there. Some of the kids that were hit, Daesh used explosive rounds in that ambush. And I remember this kid, this Kurdish 16-year-old kid, he had his whole stomach. He had like 2-3 rounds to the stomach. They all exploded in there somehow. We tried to stabilize him, and there was just this green goo coming out of the bullet, the entry wounds and stuff. It's like, what did you? Yeah, it's like I don't have. And then you know you need to consider that the Rojava vets, we don't have a VA to go to. We can't.
Right.
We don't have anywhere to seek help. There have been like quite a few suicides, and yeah, it's tricky. But for me, the best way is to write about it and to make sense about it, analyze it, put it into context, and yeah, try not to give into the urge to go to Ukraine or somewhere else.
Do you guys, the volunteers, stay in touch with each other, or do you guys stay in contact with the Kurdish communities in Canada or the United States?
Very few. I'd say surprisingly few.
Yeah.
You need the problem with the volunteers is we weren't a homogenous group either. There was so much bitching, there was so much backstabbing.
Yeah.
There was so much envy. There was so much. Why do these left European, the American combat ex-military guys would just be pissed off with a European leftist making it to the front line because they knew the ideology, and back and forth, and there was a lot of envy. There was a lot of people got into arguments, so there wasn't really this community.
We didn't really get into it, but the international volunteers, as you say, I mean, it was a motley crew. Like there were some really good guys,
yeah,
but there were also some really bad guys, that showed up.
Like there were guys that, I mean, you knew immediately they were assholes, but guys showed up. It later turned out they were wanted for rape in the US or Britain. There were guys. I had a guy on my team with an open arrest warrant for spitting at a cop. There were adventurers. There was no vetting. Like anyone who was on social media and thought like, "Oh, Syria, let's go there."
It's sort of like the old French Foreign Legion, right? Like before they started doing their vetting.
Want to get into some questions?
Yeah. So we got some questions for you guys. Why does Turkey's President Erdogan call the YPG a terrorist group?
Because affiliated with PKK that fight since the early 80s for Kurdish rights in Turkey, and because Turkey's current president is an authoritarian leader who doesn't like dissent, intellectual, practical, anywhere. So to them, they're all terrorists, and from his perspective, it kind of makes sense. From our perspective, like John and mine perspective, it's ridiculous. But like, terrorism is always a definition of, it's always about perspective, right? For the Turks, like I was called by the Turkish tabloid, I was called the leader of a group of gay terrorists, which I find hilarious, but they never liked us.
I remember my ex-wife made a documentary about the Kurds in Syria, and the Turkish tabloids called her like a PKK whore or something like this. Like,
that sounds accurate.
Yeah.
And it is like from the Turkish perspective, it's a security nightmare. So this is why they go in and want this security corridor, which means ethnic cleansing, since the Kurds live at the Syrian-Turkish border and they're all being pushed south. In like the mountain people historically are being pushed into the Syrian Sunni Arab desert. They're completely out of place there.
And thanks, Danny. Appreciate it. T-Bar, thank you. Do you guys have any impressions on the good and the bad of American air support to the SDF?
I don't have anything negative to say about the air support. I can't compare it to any other conflict, but when the war on terror started, I was at uni writing papers against it. From being a German intellectual, I'm not necessarily side of the American military.
Like
but
the drone strikes in Pakistan and things like that.
Well, that's a different, but
Right.
the drone strikes in Pakistan are so different from the air strikes
support.
called in by the Kurds
Right.
Yeah.
with the Americans. It's a completely different conflict, and there were flyovers to make sure there's not civilian targets. There was double checking. There were all sorts of I never saw an airstrike on civilians being conducted. I didn't. I know that I think the New York Times has a lot to say about Raqqa, etc. Personally, I don't have it was done as good as it could have been done in these circumstances. And it also worked to give the Kurds these airstrike apps, basically with a Google Maps, and you click on a building, and the Kurds never abused it to settle old
debts
disputes
or whatever,
old debts or anything. And the only civilian casualties I heard, and this is more anecdotal evidence, was that in basements, Daesh packed civilians, and it basically in basements of buildings, for example, would Daesh commanders would have their meetings. So when a bomb is dropped on these buildings and you go there and you look at them, it turns out there were a few families in the basement.
Right.
And this is brutal. But again, I'm not
Yeah.
I sound like a
What else could they
spokesperson
have
for the
done?
U.S. military.
Right.
But it's ISIS knows exactly how to end a Western military mission abroad.
Right.
Create civilian casualties, and the media in the U.S., Europe will say, "Oop, oop, oop." This is going sideways, and this is what Daesh did. They produced civilian casualties in airstrikes. That's not the fault of the bomber. These civvies were in there for days, weeks. If the building was watched by a drone before the strike, there was no indication they're in.
Yeah.
They didn't know.
Yeah.
And then, this is how ISIS produced casualties.
Yeah.
And this is what they did. But and this is, many of my, I sound a little bit like a spokesperson for the US military in that conflict. I have nothing bad to say about it, which is very different to the general war on terror, which, but again, I wouldn't criticize the military. I could criticize US foreign policy.
And I mean, it's hard to lambast, A-10s and 130s when they literally pull your ass out of the fire last minute.
Absolutely.
When the world is closing in on you, this is it, and then all of a sudden, it's burr.
Maybe not.
It's I listened to your podcast with what were the A-10 pilot?
Oh, yeah.
Casey, killer chick.
Okay.
She was the A-10. The AC-130 was William.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have that downloaded too. But John and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for these machines. It's and the pilots flying them.
What about you, John? So the question was, do you have any impressions on the good and bad of American air support to the SDF?
I don't think. I mean, it's a lifesaver. It's. I don't think anyone understands until you see it in action, or until it impacts you. Mm-hmm. But granted, the majority of Americans, it will never impact. But if it's explained to them in certain terms, like being a Kurd, a 18, 19-year-old Kurdish, you're Turkish probably in, ethnic origin, and now you're in Syria, and speaking from personal experience, there's a full moon, and now you see an A-10 floating by, and then it controls the night. You just assaulted a building, whatever, there's this al-Shaddadi, and I remember looking out a window, seeing the A-10, and just watching it do its job and thinking, I'm happy to be paying tax dollars for this.
Right.
It's it's something nobody.
You're
I
take
would
my
never
money.
understand. unless I saw it. But I remember being assaulting this building and being like, okay, I'm watching out here, and then watching the moon and seeing an A-10 just, lining up to its shot, and in the middle of the night, and thinking, this is what this is about. Americans, it's you'll never understand until it's laid out in front of you to be like, hey, people are going to die unless this plane does what it's got to do. And
but the Kurds, the Kurds would say the same about us. Sorry, John. The Kurds would say the same about us when the first wave of decisive airstrikes were rolled out. Like me and Sean were outside Hasakeh, and we would see the valley between Hasakeh and the Abdelaziz Mountains. And like from one moment to another, like there was 0 jets the entire conflict, and then from one moment to the other, the sky was full with jets, and all over the valley, like everywhere, shit was blowing up. It was like these like bombs burning buildings, and the Kurds were like, wow. Like
it's a religious experience, right? Like
absolutely.
And they're all because air power shows up.
Yep.
Like it's a religious experience.
Absolutely.
Yes. And the Kurds were like, it was under Obama's administration, and they were all like from one way to another, BG Haval Obama, long live Obama. Long live our comrade Obama. Like, this is what they would refer to the planes, Haval Obama. They were just grateful. Because in the past, many of these guys, they knew what NATO weapons can do, but they were used against them in the Kurdish mountains. Like, the F-16s, the Kurds knew, were flown by Turkish pilots, and they bombed the shit out of them and their families. So for them, it was like the same as for us. It was like, wow, like, this is incredible.
Yeah. Paul, thank you very much. Run into any Rusies, any Russians?
Yes.
From my perspective, there was the bombing in Kamshlu, which I was not part of, but there were some foreigners that were there.
Yes.
And
there was this very short moment in early 2016 when SDF was being formed. And again, SDF wasn't an American brainchild, it was a regional alliance. And America acknowledged that this is a very valuable alliance to have on your side. The Russians did the same. So the capital in Rojava is Kamishlo, which is still a divided city. The regime still holds quarters in there. The regime still controls the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, a border crossing with Turkey, and they control the airport. So for this very brief moment, you had a bunch of these big Antonov planes come in. You would see Russians with these stripy shirts in Kamishlo, and they were negotiating with the Kurds. They were negotiating on who SDF is going to side with, Russia or America. And they sided with America eventually, but Russia was there and they wanted SDF desperately. They saw the potential the alliance has to control territory, to control space, to appease certain groups like the Sunni Arab tribes in Deir ez-Zor. The Russian wanted the alliance.
Russia also thought they were going to get like mad street cred for defeating ISIS in Syria, and the world actually didn't really give a shit about them. And you can see where they are today. We'll save that's another podcast.
Speaking of Russia. Thanks again, Danny. Based on your experiences, what advice would you guys give to anyone considering volunteering to fight in Ukraine?
Good question.
It's quite a few guys from quite a few friends of ours fought in Ukraine, right? Yeah. There was quite a few guys went straight from YPG to Ukrainian forces. Like,
a handful of them, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's actually like, some of these guys, like this guy is from like John Harding. There was in my medic team later. He just got, he was in Mariupol and got rear guard. He was 6 months in, the Russians got him. He was in a POW camp. He just got out. A few other buddies of ours just got out of POW camp from Mariupol. So, I mean, my advice would be you don't compare the conflicts. That would be my advice. Like, it's so
totally different.
From what I can gather, it's so different in Ukraine than it was in Syria. That like, do your homework before you go. That would be my advice, I'd assume. Yeah.
John?
It's in my opinion, it's two totally different wars. Personally, I wouldn't want to sign up for that the war in Ukraine. It's there is a lot more politics involved than it is, in my opinion. I feel like the war against ISIS in Syria was more of a just war. The Ukrainian war, it gets a little more technical. So, and we have buddies, Aiden Aslan, he's a British gentleman who was he was captured by Russian forces. It's we're comparing apples and oranges, I guess you could say. I don't think they're the same. It's really tough to make a call. I think like I said, the call against ISIS, it was more of a just war. Ukraine, it's not so cut and dry, and clearly, when you're looking at what Russia's willing to do, it's not so easy.
And when you say what they're willing to do, because I mean, ISIS was willing in terms of like what they would do to people. Is that what you mean, or because ISIS didn't treat their captives well, correct?
Not at all.
No.
Yeah. Well, like Aiden, our buddy from Syria, he was sentenced to death, but the Saudi Arabian government stepped in and, similar to John Harding, I think John Harding was sentenced to death, and neither one of them actually received the death penalty. But
it would have. Yeah, with ISIS, none of us were planning to get captured, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like that just wasn't. That wasn't.
You
an
always
option.
save one round for yourself, right?
Yeah, this is a ritual. Every time your
Yeah.
position gets overrun by ISIS,
Yeah.
the spiel would be that you and your YPG buddies would share a AK round, symbolic, in case you needed the most, meaning to evade capture. I got my hand on 2 frag grenades. I had one for the enemy, the other I'd called Alamo, and I would have just pulled the pin and shoved it under my body armor. But we weren't going to get captured. That was just not an option, because there would have been no one buying us out. It would have been a very slow and painful death on life leaks.
Bad Boy Limi channel, thank you very much for the very generous donation. Said next bottle is on me, and we will buy a bottle with that. Eric L, thank you very much. Amazing info, and it really is, guys. Like, we really, really appreciate you guys coming in and sharing. Like, this is something that's so far out of the. I'll say for the general American and probably the general European, like the military is one step removed. Like, most people don't have an idea, and this is another step removed, because you're out there fighting in a different culture without the support that Western, that Americans, Western Europeans generally have, without our military structure. It's, you're just there to fight the good fight, to keep people from literally getting the worst things that you can imagine happening to people. That's what's happening.
I have a couple extra questions here. Brandon asks, did either of you work with an older Frenchman? He was there from 2015 to 2017, wounded during the Battle of Topka, and was clearing houses in Raqqa in 2017. He used to fight in Croatia in the 90s.
Yeah, I believe so.
Do you have a name?
I don't have a name now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think there were quite a few. There were quite a few older Frenchmen showing up, and they were all, like, most of them were former legionnaires.
Yeah.
Yep. But there were Yeah, I'm not sure if there was one guy I remember, but he was later was KIA in Manbij, so maybe I'm mixing them up. But yeah, there would be quite a few French dudes coming, rotating in and out.
One last thing on airstrikes. Someone
Mm-hmm.
asking, do you have any impression specifically about drone strikes during your time in Syria?
Not so much.
Okay.
I was impressed, to be
Yeah.
quite honest. I remember spending nights sleeping on rooftops and just watching off in the distance what I thought were shooting stars. We're not shooting stars.
Were you making wishes?
I was just watching stuff light up and bringing it to other people's attentions and realizing like, no, that's the next battle. Like that's far off in the. I think this was the Al Shaddadi operation, but that's off in the distance. But that's the next. You know, that's those aren't shooting stars.
Yeah.
Those are shooting Uncle Sam.
Till
Sorry,
Please go
ISIS actually used quite a few drones in Mosul, which was a real nuisance. They would do the same the Ukrainians do. They would buy like commercial drones and put like 40 mics underneath them. And like every time you would hear this lawnmower sound in the sky, it's like, fuck, that's a Daesh drone. So you go inside and hide. Yeah. They would try to hit all the medical stations and stuff. So if they see a bunch of ambulances parked, that's a prime target.
like, how do you guys find yourselves now? Because Till, you were a German academic who saw combat, which we would say that most academics from any country don't experience that. And
Yes.
you were a United States Marine and raised in this culture, not raised, but grew up in the idea of the Marine Corps, in this culture of combat, but also a very specific type of combat with very ordered and whatnot. How has this experience changed your view of the world, your view of combat, your view of the United States or Western culture, whatever it is? How has this, if it has, changed you?
Oh, it has changed. Like, to me, the experience of war has changed most things in life. Like, just the perspective on life, it changed, and what I want from it. Like, my academic career just was not important afterwards. Money or status symbol just lost importance afterwards, and that's the beauty of this war zone. When you were there, and again, I sound like an American like the war movie, but when you're there, you really just care about your friends you're with. That's all that matters. You care about your buddies, and you care about the kids you get out of the fighting. This is all that matters. Everything else is secondary, and it makes the world so wonderfully easy, right? And it divides it into right and the rest. And I love that. This is why I miss war, and this is why I think many people miss war and the fighting, because it gets simple, and you make a difference, and you don't work on a silly paper. Maybe 20 experts on the planet gonna read that is not gonna have any impact whatsoever besides your CV. Like, all of this lost complete relevance, at least to me. And my life goals changed. And my view of North America changed, quite frankly.
In what way?
Like, America, like when you come from European academia, political science, geography, sociology, American foreign policy and the associated US military or British military aren't necessarily the good guys. It gave me a completely different perspective on the people that fight wars and the kind of guys that show up to these places. And we said there's a few funny guys that showed up, but essentially they were some of the best guys I've ever met. They didn't have any university degrees. They were like shelving at Walmart, and yet they were the most solid guys. I'm so glad that I met. And the same for the US Special and the British Special Forces guys, the French Special Forces guys. They were all like solid guys. Like I just love to hang out with them. There's this one when people ask me like German civilians, like, what's it like? I'm like these dudes are incredible. Like I would overhear, the special forces guys on the sat phone with their family, and they were like their buddies were mortaring ISIS, calling in airstrikes, and they were talking their wife down from a bad day in the office. I'm like, holy fuck, who are you? It's like, it's just, to me, it's and having had the opportunity to see America's military machinery be on the side of a grassroots democratic feminist revolution, I'm just so fucking proud to have been there to see the short moment in history where everything was good, where history was just good, where the right people got the right support and bad people were like burning. And yeah, I was there and I saw it, and I played a tiny part of it, and it makes me incredibly proud. It makes me incredibly proud to have fought with the YPG. Like having fought with this all-female militia, like defines me, right? If it wouldn't be for the YPG, John and I would have been just two more guys with AKs in Syria. With the YPG, we fought for something, and we were essentially revolutionaries.
It's interesting because I've told people almost the exact same sentiment as you before, how much I loved combat because it's pure. You're not worried about social pressure. You're not worried about taxes. You're not worried about, what you're wearing. Like there's no worries or no concerns. It's pure. You don't want to get shot.
Anti-anxiety.
Yeah.
It's a weird combination.
Yeah. And what about you, John, in terms of like how it molded your experience, and did it change you in your perspective of the world, the U.S., whatever?
I'd say it certainly did. In my perspective of the world, there were certain perspectives that still stick with me, positive and negative, that I absorbed from being over there. I'd say that as for like the negative perspective, you learn to understand the negatives and how to process them, especially in terms of like trauma and all that. It's you take what is dealt to you, and then you learn to process it. I would say in a beneficial way. Maybe not for everybody, but at least for myself. I at least in Syria, when it comes to the trauma, we saw a lot of like medical trauma, but I'd say to me, the worst part of it was when I would talk to the YPG or YPG, and they didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. They maybe were not suffering physically, but they didn't see an end point for themselves after the war. They didn't see where they were going after the war.
Right.
And that, to me, that hurt the most.
The kids never talked about an after the war.
Right.
Yeah.
You ask these kids, what are you going to do next? What are your goals? And some of the 16-year-olds say, I want to die. I want to be shaheed, martyred by the time I'm 27. It's like, because also we need to understand, like, and this is what I struggled with and many others. The Kurdish culture is so different, and the Middle Eastern culture to our perspective, where individual life costs is worth so much, right? For the Kurds, it's the survival of the Kurdish nation. The individual life doesn't rank that high. The same with some of these Arab fighters. Like when I these days read up on Shaheed culture in Islam, I'm like, you idiot, went there as a medic. Like it's a completely different culture, and so many of us guys had like problems dealing with. But then again, these kids are realistic enough to know that this conflict isn't over for them. And it's not.
You told me some of the foreigners even like embraced the YOLO culture. Like,
yeah.
Well, that is shaheed, right? Shaheed, for those of you who don't know, like Arabic or whatever, it's martyr. To be
martyr.
A shaheed is to be a martyr, which is to die in service of something else.
Yes, it's
Whether
you
it's
give your life. Yeah.
Right.
but it's not like different. Like it sounds like, oh, okay, it's the same in any military. Well, the difference is it's a little bit like slightly that dying is for some is actually the goal. They're not planning to grow old. Like they're not planning to survive these wars.
Right.
And like, and to them, it's like we all fucked off again. But like once we left, Turkey went in. Once we left in, the regime in Russia went in and pushed. Once we left, they, you know,
they weren't
them,
wrong.
It was very clear. Yeah, like when we were at Mosul, I would talk to the 9th Division of the Iraqi security forces. So, guys, what's going to be after Mosul? They're like, well, we're going to fight the Peshmerga and Kirkuk. Okay, that's what they did. They fought the Peshmerga and Kirkuk. They were their buddies before. Daesh was gone. Now we want Kirkuk and the oil back. It's like there's no end. They're just like interludes into the dying and fighting, and they're the gear. Like when we left, they were starting to dig tunnels to stop the Turks from coming in from the north, right?
Yeah.
When Daesh was kind of
It tends to be a very fatalistic culture, right?
Unbelievably.
Yeah, very fatalistic. Where like Western forces, especially the American mentality, is I'll die for my country, but that's not the plan. Like I'm gonna kill everybody else for my country. But in those cultures, you know, the whole inshallah, if God wills it.
Yes.
You know, it's everything is like, well, everything's in God's hands, so whatever.
Yes. Well, the Kurds in Syria wouldn't say that necessarily because they're not very religious, but they're also very realistic. Which, like, and you know, if you go to the region, it's also a very happy society, a very in the moment society. It's like, hang on, why meet tomorrow? We might be dead. Let's meet today.
Right. What time? You know, I don't know. Whenever we get there.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you do things in the moment. It's warm. It's open hearted. It's like you show up at a random village in the middle of nowhere as a group of Europeans, and these villagers that have nothing to eat themselves invite you and share the little they have.
Yeah.
And it's like it's such a warm-hearted society. I felt very much at home there because knowledge, academia, science people loved it. People lived in this moment. People enjoyed life while they were still alive. And then it could switch to this incredibly suffering and tragedy in a moment, and then revert back. There would, like, every time we would go into battle, the YPG would open the doors of their Toyota Hiluxes and blast Kurdish music from the speakers, dance, just enjoy life. Just enjoy life. Because tomorrow we might be dead. And, you know, there was nothing like tense or, you know, pumping each other up and kill, kill, kill. You know, when you rode in battle, it was music, it was dancing, it was peace signs, it was kids coming out to the roads and waving at you. And it's beautiful.
Well, guys, I really hope that you'll go and check out the book, America's War in Syria, Fighting with Kurdish Anti-ISIS Forces by John, Baz, and I'm sorry that Sean wasn't here, but you guys should pick it up and hear some of his stories in the book that are pretty incredible. He got to spend a little bit of time in prison in Kurdistan, amongst other adventures and misadventures. So I hope you'll go take a look at the book. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. And we'll be back next Friday with, I can't even say the name of our guest on Friday. He did a lot of undercover work with the DEA. And because of some of the threats,
so you can't pronounce it, or we're just not allowed to.
I literally cannot say it, and his identity will not be revealed on the show.
And just so you guys know how important this is, like Jack and I, for a long time, have had a policy of not allowing anonymous people to come on our show because we didn't want the challenges to credibility. But we know this guy's real. We know his stories are real. Like we know, and we are allowing it.
Because there's credible threats on his life with various organized crime groups that would like to smoke this guy if they had the opportunity. So that's going to be next Friday. Hope to see you guys there. Again, thank you, Baz and John, for taking the time for this.
We really appreciate it.
This is like a really unique interview. Like Dave was saying, like this is a message and a story that most Americans just have no knowledge of whatsoever. So I'm really happy to get it out there a little bit.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
guys.
Is there anything you guys want to plug before we go, aside from your book?
Your security company.
Not so much.
Okay. Are there any charities? You said you're writing a book right now. Do you have a working title for it?
Yeah, how Iran defeats America, from Mossadegh to Rojava.
Okay.
It's a bit provocative, but
Hey.
unfortunately, it's correct, geopolitically speaking.
Yeah.
All right.
No, it's so how Iran defeats America.
Yep.
And then are there any charities or organizations either of you want to plug?
Well,
No.
I mean,
Okay.
John and I working on one at the moment, but it's nothing to talk about yet. I think.
When you guys are there, let us know. We'll plug it even if you're not on the show.
Awesome.
We'll
Thanks
do
so
it
much.
again. All right, guys. Thank you. And we'll see you next Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Take care.